民的研究。所以今天非常高兴有这个机会也能来听这个讲者讲这些关于电影在线，还有一些关于指名后指名的一些问题。那我先来介绍一下今天的主要讲者跟几位的语坛人。第一个就是我们的主要的讲者是阮氏兰欣，然后他今天的讲题就是非常有趣哦，他的中文讲题是当代越南电影里的性交易，国内观点与这个侨民的角度。那所以英文的是我念一下好了，是 Prostitution in Contemporary Vietnamese Cinema, a Domestic Lens versus a Pornographic Perspective。所以他会比较这个关于性工作如何在当代越南电影当中的再现，透过在国内的影像呈现跟这个侨民的角度来探讨这个性工作如何再现的问题。那阮氏兰欣呢，他是一个刚刚没有提到，他是一个影像研究者，他目前是国立阳明交通大学的社会与文化研究所的博士生。然后今天我们有2位，其实是3位语坛人，但时间的关系，我会尽量限缩我自己的部分哦。那第一位的语坛人是那个布洛萨教授，他是国立成功大学的一山学者，也是巴黎第8大学哲学系的名誉教授。那大家应该都蛮熟悉了，因为他上个礼拜已经给我们做过一次讲座了。那第2位呢是董范老师Frank Dong， 也是我们国立成功大学历史学系的副教授。那这个我看一下哦，那个布洛萨教授呢，他主要的研究专长呢是当代法国哲学思想，关注这个庶民跟社会底层主体性的议题，同时着力于这文化与这个知识解质的研究。那他当然已经出过很多的出版作品，包括中英文的。那尤其在中文的话，这个可见度比较高的是关于妇科的研究，跟妇科与中国维宪哲学家那天出版的跟妇科与中国做开的交汇，这2本主要的中文版著作。那董芬老师呢，他是耶鲁大学的史学博士，那他的研究专长包括全球史、英民史、东南亚。还有伊斯兰社会国族主义殖民研究第2次世界大战荷兰殖民史等。所以董范老师对于这个东南亚的专精也可以，我相信也可以对我们今天的讨论带来很精彩的部分。那因为时间的关系我想就不需要再做英文的翻译，关于这些讲者介绍。在座有没有人需要英文翻译介绍讲者？没有的话，那我们就可以直接把时间交给兰欣。
Thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. It is such an honor to be standing here and talking about my little projects today with everyone. So, thank you very much for this opportunity. This presentation is actually part of my dissertation project, which is for the moment tentatively titled Prostitution in Contemporary Vietnam Through the Lens of Vietnamese Cinema. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the portrayal of the prostitute's figure in Vietnamese cinema, but in 3 films, Bar Girls and Street Cinderella. These 2 films on the right by Vietnamese domestic filmmaker Le Hoang. Vietnamese domestic because he was born and has spent his entire life in Vietnam. So that's what I call him here, the Vietnamese domestic. And the other film, 3 Seasons, by Vietnamese American filmmaker Tony Bui. These films were made in 1999, 2003, and 2004. So, and of course, the title of this presentation is Prostitution in Contemporary Vietnamese Cinema, a Domestic Lens versus a Diasporic Perspective. So I juxtapose Le Hoang's domestic perspective with Tony Bui's diasporic perspective in viewing prostitution in Vietnam, because in my observation, usually there is a conflation of Vietnamese domestic and Vietnamese diasporic perspectives when people talk about cultural products like films and books. But I think this is problematic because the Vietnamese people, here on this map, you can see that the Vietnamese involves a lot of different populations. Vietnamese living in Vietnam, and over the years, over the length of a very diverse history, very rich history of the country of Vietnam, the people have moved and settled in a lot of different regions in the world. So perhaps there's a good intention here of demonopolizing Western centrism, people label certain cultural products Vietnamese. But what does it mean to be Vietnamese? And can the label Vietnamese be applied indiscriminately to all Vietnamese people without further clarification? So, sorry, there must be some translation. So, yes, please.
OK， 那我今天的发表会是关于我的博士论文研究计划的其中一部分。那么我博士论文研究计划目前一个暂时的名字叫做《在越南电影的镜头下的当代越南的性交易》。那我今天的这个发表会主要聚焦在3部电影，那也就是黎煌在2003年的《舞女》跟2004年的街头灰姑娘，还有裴东尼在1999年的《恋恋三季》。那我会关注这3部电影，他们在描绘这些性工作者他们之间的形象上的差别。那我会把黎煌这个比较本土式的观点，还有裴东尼这个对我来说是离散的、是侨居海外的这个观点并成，是因为我认为有某些时候我们会把这些不管是国内的或者是国外的越南人，通通合并一谈，然后视为都是越南的。然而事实上，这一些他们或许只是因为其中有一些主要的角色讲越南话，或者是他的作品是用越南话写成的或越南话说的，但是这里面有一些可能是它有一些好利益良善的部分，是它是一个对于美国中心主义、对于垄断的西方中心主义的一种反抗。但是到底越南的代表什么意义呢？越南人或者是越南的这样的一个字眼，它是一个可以无差别的来指涉所有的越南人，好像是越南或者越南人本来都是一个铁板一块式的一个分类这样子吗？
And in reality, actually, lots of different cultural products, such as the film The Scent of Green Papaya, or 3 Seasons, or most recently the book The Sympathizer, they are perceived as Vietnamese, and they're very well known. Perceived as Vietnamese, but they're actually creations of Vietnamese diasporic people, Vietnamese American in those 2 cases, and Vietnamese French in the case of The Scent of Green Papaya. Some people, by just calling all these Vietnamese French, Vietnamese American, Vietnamese Australian, and Vietnamese, just Vietnamese, I see that some people neglect the rich history and very diverse culture of the country of Vietnam, including Vietnamese people living in the country and Vietnamese overseas people. So, while these communities, they actually experience diverse cultural, like very different languages, very different cultures, and different political systems that enrich and inform their cultural and political identities in vastly different ways. So by differentiating Vietnamese domestic and Vietnamese diasporic, I do not wish to divide the nation or identify who are and who are not Vietnamese authentic people, not at all. I just want to acknowledge the diversity and the idiosyncrasies of these communities.
OK， 所以事实上有非常多杰出的这些文化产品，他们都被国际上的学者或国际市场称之为越南的，但其实其中有很多是这些离散的越南人他们的作品。那离散的越南人就是侨居海外的越南人这个类别，他们是在1970年代末，因为第2次印度支那战争的关系，然后迁移到海外，到美国、到法国、到澳洲的一群越南人的这样子的一个类别。 那如果我们把这一些就是离散的越南人跟本土的越南人，通通都称之为越南人的话，那我们事实上就忽略了这一段复杂而多元的历史。那么我们也忽略了这一些侨居海外的越南人，他们经历过那不一样，那些不同的文化、不同的语言、不同的政治体系，并且这些东西为他们带来的他们在政治上或文化上的非常具有差异性的认同。那但是呢，我对于区别这个国内的越南人或者是国外的越南人这样子的一个区别，并不是试图要来分裂国家或者是分裂这个民族，也更不是要来区分谁才是真正的越南人，而谁不是真正的越南人，这样子的一个类别其实也确实完全不存在。而是我的这个区隔，事实上是希望能够让我们来承认这两个社群之间他们的差异性，还有他们各自的特性。
So in this particular presentation, I would like to analyze the perceptions and constructions of prostitution in Vietnam in the late 1990s and early 2000s by these two filmmakers here. And I acknowledge that Le films, these two films do not represent all Vietnamese domestic filmmakers' accounts of prostitution. In the same way, Tony Bui does not represent all Vietnamese American community and how they perceive prostitution. But it's very significant to acknowledge that their perceptions and their accounts of prostitution are informed and shaped by their experience of living inside or outside Vietnam.
那所以，我今天透过黎煌跟裴东尼的这几部电影要来讨论的这个国内的越南电影观点，或者是离散的越南电影观点，是他们对于1990年代晚期到2000年初期的性交易跟当时的娼妓有非常不一样的观点。那当然，黎煌的电影并没有办法代表所有越南导演对于性交易的观点。那同样的，裴东尼的电影也没有办法代表在美国的越南人社群他们对于这个议题的观点。我必须要说，他们各自对于这个议题的观点都非常高程度的受他们在越南或者在海外的生命经验所形塑。
Now, before we move on to talk about our main topic today, which is the films, let's take a very quick look at the historical context of Vietnam in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So before that, here's some historical facts. So after winning the Second Indochina War against the American and South Vietnam in 1975, the Vietnamese Communist Party reunited North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and they started doing what is called centrally planned economic model over the whole country, the whole newly united nation. But for many reasons, the socialist economy failed, and the country was crushed with poverty and hunger. One of the reasons, as you can see on the slide, is natural disasters. They destroyed the crops, and at the same time, very weak and incompetent management and corruption also deprived Vietnamese people of the very meager government subsidies that they were promised to. And there was also the border war with China in 1979 that cost Vietnam the more or less friendly relationship with China, which had provided aid to the country, to Vietnam on many occasions up to that point. And also the US, after losing the war in Vietnam, they imposed a trade embargo, which lasted for 20 years until 1994. And also under the US's influence, lots of other countries also imposed economic sanctions on Vietnam. And the last element was that the dissolution of USSR. The USSR, Vietnam's ally at the time, also provided lots of aid until towards the end of 1980s, when they were heading towards dissolution in 1991.
那在我们进到我们今天的主题，也就是电影之前，我们先快速的浏览一下，在90年代末期到2000年初期越南的这个历史脉络。 那在1975年，也就是在1975年第二次印度支那战争当中，越南共产党他们打败了南越跟美国，他们很快的统一了国家之后，他们就展开了一个就是国家中央控管的计划经济的模式。那因为非常多的原因，这个计划经济的模型最后失败了，然后整个国家就陷入了贫穷跟饥荒当中。那其中原因包括就是在一开始有一些自然灾害，让他们的谷物收成大量减少，然后还有就是他们非常差劲的管理，还有贪污的问题，让计划配给的那一点点配给都没有办法被发出来。那还有就是在1979年，越南跟中国的边界战争也让他们失去了在当时提供他们相当多援助的中国这个盟友。那在国际上，美国的禁运令，还有就是跟美国相关的其他国家对越南做出来的经济制裁，还有最严重的、最重要的一个原因是1980年代晚期，他们最有力的盟友，也就是苏联，因为东欧集团开始在解体了，所以他们从苏联那里得到的援助也开始大量的减少。
Okay, and because of these difficulties in 1986. The Vietnamese Communist Party decided to adopt a new economic model called the socialist-oriented market economy. This fundamentally means that the closed government-subsidized economy now is opened up for foreign investments. Remember that before 1986, it was enclosed in the country. The government decided what to manufacture and how to distribute the wealth and commodities inside the country. But now, after 1986, the country is opened to foreign investment, and the exportation and importation of commodities is now not only allowed but also promoted and encouraged. And Doi Moi, the name of the policy is Doi Moi. In English, it means renovation. So the policy of renovation changed the country drastically. And here are some images. Okay, so we have before Doi Moi images and after Doi Moi images. But these are only, estimation, But basically, over the last 30 years, the country has advanced economically, like very, very fast. And here is one same spot in Ho Chi Minh City, the King Air Canal. That was before Doi Moi, and this is after Doi Moi. So you can, put this into perspective how much the country has changed. So such a drastic economic and political change as well, not only economic but also political, has no doubt led to substantial transformations within Vietnamese society, including the proliferation of prostitution. Before 1986, between 75 and 86, because it was a socialist society, no documentations are found about prostitution in Vietnam during that period. Maybe there was prostitution, maybe there was not, but there's no document about that. I'm pretty sure that there was some, but it was not like absolute, right? Thank you.
那因为这一些刚前面说的这一些原因，所以在那个经济上非常动荡的时候，越南共产党在第6次的国会，在1986年，他们决定要采取一个改革开放的措施。所以他们宣布他们采取了一个新的经济模型，叫做社会主义导向的市场经济。那这个改革政策，在越南被称之为 Doi Moi。然后他们这个改革政策开始放弃了过去中央计划经济的这个模型，然后并且开放外资跟开放国外商品的进出口。那在1986年以前，整个越南国家是封闭的，在里面的商品生产或者是消费都是经由国家统一配管的。那在1986年之后，刚才有个图片可以让我们看到胡志明市，以胡志明市为例的话，越南经济有多大的经济上面的成长。那不只是经济上的成长，还有这个政治上的这种剧烈改变，也让整个越南社会进入一个非常动荡的时期。 那也产生了非常多实质的社会变化，其中就包括大量衍生的性交易。那我其实汉他并不认为就是在1986年之前，越南就是没有性交易的，但是因为1986年之前是一个社会主义式的时期，所以并没有基本上没有任何文件留下来有记载当时有性交易。
Alright, now let's get back to our main theme today, the films. Before getting into these films, let's take a look at the filmmakers. This one, Le Hoang, he was born in 1956 in Vietnam and has spent his entire life in the country. His film career has pretty much paralleled the development of the country. He started out making art films that were critically acclaimed for their aesthetics. But when the country began economic reform, he also began his career reform, his film career reform. Le Hoang was the first filmmaker in Vietnam that switched from making socialist artist films to making popular commercial movies. And he was the first one to try to draw Vietnamese audiences back to Vietnamese movies, because like in the 1990s, Hong Kong movies, Hong Kong kung fu movies, and Korean soap opera and Hollywood movies were very popular in Vietnam, but Vietnamese movies never, like very few of them drew the audiences to the cinema. So one of his main purposes when making his first commercial films was to draw the audiences back to the Vietnamese movies, and of course to make money. So in 2003, he made his first commercial movie in Vietnamese, Gái Nhảy, Bargos, and it broke all the box office records for Vietnamese films up to that point in time. And in 2004, he made Gái Nhảy sequel called Street Cinderella. They both were very successful in terms of finance. And he was actually criticized, especially by his fellow filmmakers, for using, he was perceived as using cheap gimmicks and, sex and drugs and violence to provoke audiences' curiosity, and he was not appreciated in terms of art and aesthetics for these films.
那现在让我们回到我们的主题。那首先我们介绍的是黎煌这位导演，他是在越南出生长大，并且他的一生都是在越南度过的。那他的电影生涯其实相当程度跟整个越南的国家发展轨迹是平行的，也就是他一开始是以他的艺术电影大获好评。那但是当整个国家开始进入这个新自由经济的转向的时候，他也开始重建他的电影生涯。那黎煌是越南整个国家第一个从过去的那个社会主义写实主义电影开始转拍商业片的导演。那当然他是想要重新把市场上本来已经被香港电影、被好莱坞电影占据的这个市场重新把越南电影带进去。那当然也就是为了要赚钱。那在2003年，他的第一部商业电影就是《舞女》，突破了越南的票房纪录。而在2004年，他也拍了《舞女》的续集，就是街头灰姑娘。那这两部电影都在票房成绩上得到前所未有的成功。而同时，黎煌他也被他就是过去那些艺术电影的同行批评为，他的电影都是用一些性、毒品、暴力这一些廉价的伎俩来刺激观众的好奇心。
Let's move on to Tony Bui. He's an Vietnamese American independent filmmaker. He was born in 1973, only 2 years before the defeat of Saigon or the fall of Saigon, depending on where you stand on this. He was born and then in 1973, and then 2 years later, when he was only 2 years old, he fled the country with his family when, after the fall of Saigon. And he had been living in the US, and he only paid his first visit to Vietnam when he was 19 years old. When he was 26, he made 3 seasons. and that's Green Dragon. I think he made it after 3 Seasons. Before 3 Seasons, 3 Seasons was his first featured film, like a long featured film. Before that, he made one short film called Yellow Lotus. And 3 Seasons was the first America-produced film that was made entirely in Vietnam after the Vietnam War, when the trade embargo that I mentioned earlier was lifted in 1994, and that led to the normalization of the Vietnam-US diplomatic relation in 1995. 3 Seasons won several prestigious awards, such as the Havana Film Festival Award, or in lots of film festivals such as Havana, Sundance, and Cannes. And he himself was highly applauded by the Vietnamese American community in the US, and he was featured on the 25 Years for 25 Vietnamese Americans. His film was significant to the Vietnamese community in the US because it provided one of the rare occasions where the Vietnamese are portrayed very differently from the very well-established stereotypes of Vietnamese people in American Hollywood war films.
那第二位导演是裴东尼，他是在越南出生的。那在他2岁的时候，也就是北越军攻进西贡的时候，他跟他的家人一起逃亡到国外。那从那个时候开始，他就住在美国，直到他19岁的时候才第一次回到越南。那在26岁的时候，他拍了《念念三季》这部电影。《念念三季》这部电影是在1996年以来，也就是1996年美国跟越南关系正常化以来第一部在越南拍的美国电影。那《念念三季》在非常多大的影展中都赢得奖项，包括日舞影展、坎城跟哈瓦那影展。而裴东尼也因为这部片高度的受在美国的越南人社群赞赏，而这也让他登上了那个25年来20位最重要的美籍越南裔的杂志封面。而这部电影重要的地方在于，他为在美国的越南人提供了一个跟过去好莱坞建构的那种刻板印象不一样的一个形象。
This presentation will focus not on the criticism nor the acclaim of these films and these filmmakers, but I would like to focus on the discourses of prostitution in these 3 films. Here on the slide, you see some real images of prostitution in Southeast Asia that I pulled from this website by this Dr. Niklas Leineth. He has done lots of intensive research about prostitution in Vietnam and sex trafficking in Southeast Asia. So these are real images of prostitution. So because of the time limit, what I'm going to present today will not make an exhaustive list of what I would like to discuss about the differences between the perspectives between these two perspectives, of these 2 filmmakers. But I'm only going to focus on these main points. First of all, the difference in the narrative perspectives in these films leads to the very distinctive ways that the prostitute is portrayed. Le Hoang's prostitute characters are constructed as multiple, subversive, and transformative. Meanwhile, the prostitute characters in Tony Bui's film is ultimately voiceless and subservient. And another point of divergence is that Tony Bui views prostitution as a moral problem and then offers the solution of domesticating, taming the prostitute. Meanwhile, Le Hoang views prostitution as a social problem in which the prostitutes' characters or prostitutes are vulnerable and exposed to abuse, exploitation, and violence. And because Le Hoang's film is set in the contemporary context where prostitution continues to unfold itself, he sees it as an enigma or a conundrum that needs substantial effort to understand and to demystify. While Tony Bui looks past these current social structures, because he would like there's like a yearning, a very obvious yearning for the good old days in Tony Bui's films, and that's why I think he overlooks the structures, the systems that prostitution is situated in.
OK， 那我们今天的那刚才一开始的那些照片，就是现在就是在越南真实的那个性工作的真实的照片，他们是一位学者叫 Nguyen Thi Lan 他所做的在关于越南的性交易的研究，那也包括了人口贩卖这一些东西在里面。我今天的发表并没有要关注在这些电影他们所收到的好评或者是恶评上面。我今天想要分析的是在这些电影当中，他们所对于性交易所产生的这些论述。那因为时间的关系，所以我今天也没有办法把这些电影当中所有的观点差异都列出来。那首先一个最重要的差异是，他们在这些电影之间叙事角度的这个差异，也就是在黎煌的电影当中，他的娼妓的这些角色，他们是被建构为多样的，然后具有颠覆性，而且是可以改变的。而同时，在裴东林的电影当中，娼妓的角色，他们最终都会是没有发言权，而是悲剧的。那另外一个分歧点则是，裴东林他把整个性交易这件事情看作为一个道德问题，并且他提供的一个解决方案，也就是驯化这一些娼妓，让他们重回家庭当中。而同时，黎煌他关注性交易的方式是，他认为这是一个社会问题，而在这个社会问题当中，这一些性工作者他们其实长期暴露在暴力，长期暴露在被虐待跟被剥削的情况当中。所以随着性交易在这个当代的脉络当中，它还是持续的在发展的。那黎煌认为性交易这件事情是需要我们努力来厘清它到底是什么的一件事。而另外一方面，裴东尼他则是把性交易看作一个被现代性的堕落所污染的一个当下，而他所要追寻的是那个还没有被污染的过去。
Okay, now let's take a look at the few main characters in these three films. On the left, we have three citizens, and we have two main characters whom I'm going to discuss today. The first one is prostitute Lan. Her name is Lan. So when I say Lan later, I refer to this character. And then the cyclo driver Hai over there. And if you don't know what a cyclo is, you can see that vehicle in a smaller picture. Some people call it a bicycle taxi. In Vietnam, it's called cyclo, and the English term is cyclo. And on the left, we have these three main characters in Boggles and Street Cinderella. The first one is a journalist. Her name is Sum, and she is in Boggles. The second one, she's a prostitute. Her name is Hoa. She's in both Boggles and Street Cinderella. Same name, same occupation. She's a prostitute in both films, but she seems to be complete different people in these two films. And then the last one, she has the same name as me, Hanh. She's a prostitute in Boggles. That's a scene from Boggles. And she's an actress who tries to portray a prostitute in Street Cinderella. So, different characters there. Also, same name.
Okay, 那这几个图像是大家可以记忆一下，就是等一下我在不同的电影会只知道这些人。那首先在左上的这个就是在《烈焰三季》当中的烂的那个，也就是在《烈焰三季》当中的那个娼妓的角色。那在下面就是那个人力车夫，他叫做Hai。然后在右上的这一位是在就是《舞女》这部电影当中饰演记者，然后对的角色。那在中间的这个话，他在《烈焰三季》他在《舞女》跟在街头灰姑娘当中，在这两部电影当中都有一个叫做画的角色，然后也都是他演的。那但是这两个角色是不一样的角色。那在最下面这个 他则是在舞女当中演娼妓，然后这个演员他在街头灰姑娘当中则是演一个试图要揣摩娼妓的女演员。
All right. Now, first of all, the narrative perspective. This narrative perspective, which is very different in Bargles and Street Cinderella and in Three Seasons, leads to the very the differences that the prostitute is portrayed in these three films. While Bargles and Street Cinderella let the sex workers themselves to unveil their own stories, Three Seasons let us or lead us, the audience, to the story of the prostitute through the eyes of the cyclo driver. So when the film Bargles, when it starts, we see that the character, Soon, the journalist, she is trying to write a reportage about prostitute women, about Bargles. So with that narrative that the film begins with, it could have let the story be told by the journalist, but with a pivotal plot point where the journalist is beaten up by the prostitutes, she gets expelled from the bar and from their community, and the prostitutes reappropriate their right to tell their own story. Meanwhile, in Three Seasons, spectators are given access to the prostitute's story only through Han's perspective, who throughout the film acts as a narrator, and the film director's screen surrogate, rather than a character in the film like any other character who has their own story. He actually doesn't have a story, and he just connects all the stories together. These different points from which the film regards the prostitute renders essential differences from how the prostitute is portrayed. And after this translation, I'll show you some video clips to demonstrate my point.
那首先在这几部电影当中，一个最大的差别就是叙事者的角度的不一样。在舞女或在街头灰姑娘当中，这一些娼妓他们的故事都是这些性工作者他们自己讲他们自己的故事，而在后者，在就是《恋恋三世》这一部电影当中，这娼妓她的故事则是通过这个人力车夫的观点讲出来的。那在舞女这部电影，其实一开始是有一个记者这样子的角色，他是试图要写关于娼妓们的故事的一篇报道，但是在一个重要的情节，在其中一个情节，这个记者被这些娼妓们赶出他的酒吧，然后被赶出他们的社群，所以通过这件事情，这些娼妓他们重新拿回他们自己的发语权，而同时，但相对的，在《恋恋三季》当中，我们作为观众，我们只能从人力车夫的这个视角里面来看那个娼妓她的故事。
So in Le Hang's films, Bargles and Street Cinderella, as the prostitutes tell their own stories, their miscellaneous life activities, as well as their inner battle and inner struggles are brought to light. And unlike the traditional perception of the prostitute, the traditional Vietnamese perception of the prostitute, which is usually considered as a victim of their circumstances, in Bargles and Street Cinderella, there is no longer simply she is no longer a mere victim of her circumstances, nor is she sacrificing herself for the family or the nation, because the most iconic and traditional Vietnamese prostitute is a prostitute named Gil in The Tale of Gil, and she sacrifices herself. She sells herself to a man in order to save her father and brother from imprisonment. So that is a very iconic Vietnamese prostitute in literature. And it's not like that with Bargles and Street Cinderella. In these films, prostitutes are characters with complexity and transformation. Sometimes a victim, sometimes a villain, sometimes innocent, and sometimes not so innocent, sometimes very corrupt. She may be a sacrificing mother, but she may also be a very wanton and rebellious daughter. In these films, this is Hanh. Here she is. Here is also Hanh. she is shown in a lot of scenes with babies. Here's one, here's another, and some other scenes also with babies. But women in Bargos and Street Cinderella are not considered ultimately as mothers. And this is Hoa. While most of the other prostitutes are shown with babies like these, she is never shown with a baby in the same frame. Never. She actually represents the furthest possible image away from the image of a mother. She is a drug addict, and she only cares about how to feed her insatiable hunger for heroin. And here she is using heroin. Here's another one where she injects herself with heroin. And here, this is her image of a very subversive, very rebellious daughter over here. And okay, I think that's good. Thank you.
OK， 那在黎黄的电影当中，这些不同的娼妓，他们都有他各自的故事，所以这也让我们看到，就是这些娼妓他们不同的生命经验、不同的生命活动，还有他们那些内在，还有他们很多的内在冲突。那不像是传统，就是越南电影传统在描述就是娼妓的方式，比如说那个有一部电影叫做《Gio 的故事》，就在这部电影当中 ，Gio 她也就是一个娼妓，然后她为了救她的爸爸跟哥哥，然后嫁给了某个男人这样子。在相对的，在就是舞女或者是像这种灰姑娘这样子的故事当中，娼妓他们不一定是某一个境况的受害者，他们也不一定是为了家庭或为了国家在牺牲自己的人。在这些电影当中，娼妓他们是具有异质性的，他们也是具有可变性的。他们有时候是受害者，然后有时候是坏人，他们有时候是无辜的，也有时候他们是腐败的。他可能会是一个在牺牲自我的母亲，他也有可能是一个荡妇，是一个叛逆的女儿。在舞女当中，汉就是中间下面的那个角色，他的母性，他的母爱，在他很多场戏当中都是由他跟他都会有一个小孩，他跟小孩的互动当中展现出来。但是在这一部电影当中，并不是所有的女人都最后都会变成母亲。虽然在这个电影当中，很多娼妓他们都是带着他们的小孩，但其中之一就是华，也就是在荧幕的右上的这个女角色，她相反的，她是一个母亲形象的反面，也就是她是一个毒虫，她是一个药物成瘾者，然后他在这个现在他其实根本不在乎任何事情，他只想要想办法弄到更多海洛因。
Yeah, and Hoa is also not a poor person, like lots of other sex workers who have to work to earn money and escape poverty. She is actually from a very wealthy family whose father is a professor and a scientist, who also is a character in the film that you will see later. So she's actually the counter image of the traditional Vietnamese victim prostitutes.
所以这个华，他另外一方面，他也不是来自于一个非常贫穷的生长背景。他的爸爸在故事里面是一个有钱然后成功的大学教授，一个科学家。然后所以他其实完全是作为一个传统越南文化当中在描写娼妓的一个反面，也就是他其实并不完全是，他是完全不是受害者。
Also, as a prostitute, she really disregards men, which is very radical because prostitute women need men in order to make money, right? But she really disregards men, and so she's a radical, subversive prostitute character. She either humiliates them, demasculinizes them, or rejects them. So this is her first appearance in Bargos, where she's sitting in a table, enjoying an ice cream soda there on the table, and just enjoying the music, enjoying herself. And then there's this man who approaches her with a small bottle, like what you can see, a bottle over there, and he offers her a drink. But then when he tries to do that, she pulls out a massive bottle, a gigantic bottle from under the table, and then he feels very ashamed because that's very demasculinizing. Because according to some scholar, actually, what's her name? Doi. She wrote a very nice article about this film, and she calls her a phallic woman, and that the bottles actually represent the penis, and so her penis is actually a lot bigger than his, so he's too ashamed, so he leaves. Now here, let's take a look at this clip of that scene.
OK， 那所以作为一个娼妓花，她也是非常激进的，她也是非常激进的展现在她对于男人的漠视，她对男人的满不在乎上面。但这是非常激进的事情，因为所有娼妓他们都需要男人来赚钱。那在刚描述的这场戏，就是他在一个酒吧里面喝他的汽水，然后有一个男人拿了一个威士忌拿了一瓶威士忌来，想要请他喝酒，然后结果他拿出一个更大瓶的超大瓶威士忌出来，就是羞辱他。所以就是在这个电影当中，他也很多次这样持续的，他也是很多次持续的在羞辱这些男人，在降低他们的男性尊严，在拒绝他们。那刚才也提到，就是有一个学者，他对于这部电影写了一篇非常好的文章，然后他将这个大瓶的威士忌作为一个比喻，也就是他把话称为就是法利普那个带种的女人，也就是有阳具的女人，然后他就说这个威士忌事实上就象征着他比那个男人还要有一个更大的阳具。
And so in Bargos and Sweet Cinderella, the prostitute character is not quite simple. She's characterized as quite, well, because there are different prostitute characters. So the prostitute is characterized as multiple and complex, and even radical and subversive, like this particular character. Meanwhile, in Three Seasons, Lan, the prostitute character, becomes progressively docile and subservient towards the end of the film as the film unfolds. At the beginning of the film, Lan appears to be a feisty fighter, like in this scene when Hanh notices her running from a conflict with potential clients. And I will show you this clip in a bit. And at the beginning, Lan is a perceptive and a very intelligent woman who does not shy away from stating her strong opinions and her sharp thoughts and strong opinions. And she also had a very savvy comment on how the city and people's lives are influenced by the globalizing forces in Ho Chi Minh City. Here's what she says: "They are not like us." And they here she means rich people. They are not like us. They have a different talk, a different walk. The sun rises for them, not for us. We lie in their shadow, and it grows larger with each hotel they build. One day I will remain in their worlds, even if I have to marry one of them to become like them. And so she is in fact quite an astute observer and an active participant in modern life in Vietnam. And here in this clip, I'd like to show you this clip I already showed you earlier when she comes into our view because of Hanh. And here, this one is when she shows her opinions about the city.
那所以在黎煌的电影当中，这些娼妓他们是非常的复杂的，然后也有非常多不一样多样的娼妓的这些女人，然后他们各自不一样的故事。然而在《恋恋三季》当中的娼妓，它就是随着故事的发展，然后逐渐的变得越来越温驯，然后越来越悲屈。从最一开始，Lan就是像我们刚看的那样一个就是好胜的一个敢于表达自己意见的一个女性，到最后她完全失去了她的声音。那我们可以看到Lan她其实是一个有她自己的观点，然后一个聪明的女人。 那他也从不畏惧表达他自己的想法，而他对于在这个全球化时代当中的这个胡志明市的发展，也有他自己的一个洞见。他说，他们跟我们不一样，他们有他们讲话的方式，他们走路的方式。这个世界的太阳是为他们而升起的，而不是为我们。我们只能寄居在他们的阴影之下，而这个阴影会随着他们的饭店越盖越多，然后变得越来越大。但是有一天，我会留在他们的世界里面，即使我需要嫁给他们，然后变成他们其中一份子。所以，事实上，他其实对于越南当代社会的发展，其实是一个非常精明的一个观察者，而他也同时是一个非常积极的参与者。所以我们可以看到，他就是直接很直接的就反驳了那个人力车夫讲的东西，然后就是很酸的跟他说啊，那我如果不嫁给他们，难道我要嫁给一个人力车夫这样子？
So that is her in the beginning of the film, very articulate, very opinionated, strong-headed, and yet in the end she becomes literally voiceless, like she doesn't have a say at all. How does such sophistication and candidness and articulateness become so utterly silent in the end, and how spectacularly she falls behind this paternalism? Some scholars say that Lan represents a confused Vietnamese identity that is unsure about her path in the times of transitioning and of change, that she symbolizes a confused Vietnam that wants to advance economically but questions herself repeatedly during the process. With this inner struggle that characterizes part of the Vietnamese youth and also the country as a metaphor, this character could have been made as a very interesting, appealing character that is relatable to Vietnamese people and with an eventful arc. But it's not how the film constructs this prostitute character. She simply switches from one extreme to the other on the outspoken, voiceless continuum, as well as the innocent, impure continuum, from a very rebellious, materialistic prostitute who is unafraid to state her opinion. Lan simply quietly returns to subservience, innocence, and purity. That is according to Hanh opinion. And in what comes next, I will offer an analysis of the final scene, this in particular, the concluding sequence of the film 3 Seasons.
OK， 那所以，但是像刚那样，但是到了最后，Lan却变成一个完全失去发言权的人。到底为什么这样子一个就是这么世故，然后这么坦率，然后有这样子表达能力的人，最后会变成完全的沉默呢？他最后到底是如何落进就是Hanh的这种家父长制的这种父权的思路里面？有一些评论说Lan代表的是Lan他这个就是转型的这个路线，代表的事实上就是越南跟整个越南国家他们在追求经济发展的同时，然后有非常多自我怀疑的这个过程是一样的。那所以如果像是Lan有这样子的一个内在冲突的话，那么它其实是大可以被描绘成一个跟整个越南社会有非常多直接关系的一个很有趣、非常重要、有深度的一个角色。但是事实上并没有，在这个电影当中，它只是简单的从一个极端，然后被转型到另外一个极端，也就是从一个本来很多话的、很有表达能力的一个人，然后最后变成一个失去发言权，然后一个纯洁的、一个悲屈、一个无辜的一个个体。那而这些特质，当然是根据就是Hanh的意见，根据Hanh的意愿而来的。那在接下来，我会做就是《恋恋三季》这部电影的结尾这场戏的一个详细的分析。所以因为有这个就是要重新换回这个就是犯错的娼妓他的那个内在道德这样子的一个目标，所以这场电影的这个结尾其实一点都不令人意外。那在这场戏当中，我们可以看到就是Hanh他带着Lan来实现他的梦想，然后他带着一个满足的笑容，然后把他的人力车的那个敞篷揭开，然后好让那个Lan下车，然后走进他的那个，然后带着他的那个红丝布的眼罩，然后穿着那个白色的 那个白色的这个衣服，其实是越南的女学生她们在穿的制服，穿着这样子的装扮，然后走进她的梦幻的场景。那她走在随着她走在在这边，我们会看到就是她的视线跟蓝，就是随着她的这个场面调度，他们的视线开始合而为一。然后接下来烂的眼罩被揭开之后，他开始用他这一对就是新的刚被Hanh唤醒的那一对新的眼睛来环顾那个漂亮的景色。然后在这个时候Hanh拿出他那个珍藏多年的那本老书，然后这本老书事实上用一个特写镜头，它其实是同时要给观众也是给我们看的，也就是这本书的标题叫做翻译过来的话就叫做锻炼道德，就是磨练你的道德。那显然这就是一个Hanh他交给Lan的一个意识形态的一个机器。那跟着他把这个书交给Lan的同时，他也说从现在开始你不需要再隐藏你自己了。那这句话背后的意义，其实也就是说，整个性交易对Hanh来说从头到尾就是一个谎言，它是一件虚假的一件错误的事情。那Lan就接下了这本书，然后他就是很温驯的笑了笑，然后一句话都没有说。然后所以到这里，他再一次就是让我们完成了这个Lan的整个从一开始一个非常有主见、非常有声量的女生，然后转变到最后变成一个失去发言权的、再也没有任何挑战力的一个女人。那最后的一个结尾的镜头，也就是停在Hanh的脸上，然后他带着一抹笑容，然后把他帽子拿下来，作为他就是终于完成了这个任务，完成了这个重建一个迷途的娼妓的内在道德这个任务的一个手势。
Alright, and then there's this part where I analyze the music. I'll just read it out for you and then we'll move on from this scene. Emerging from the beginning and getting more and more prominent towards the end of this sequence is the eerie traditional music that I tried to draw your attention to earlier, that is noticeably absent from Lan's early scenes. In the beginning, Lan's appearance is usually accompanied or rather distracted by the noises from the surrounding crowds or vehicles on the street. So from being a materialistic prostitute who only hears noises from the material world, towards the end of the film, when Lan finally accepts and subscribes to Hanh morality, Lan has now transformed into being the kind of Vietnamese woman whose presence deserves the compliment of folk music. This sequence marked Lan's full restoration of her virtuous, authentic Vietnamese self. Her musical voice is now in sync with traditional Vietnamese melodies, and Hanh insistence on driving her home on his sickle after many times she has refused his service is an allegory of his adamant commitment to drive her back to Vietnamese traditional values. The final scene with his sickle parked outside her house seems to indicate the accomplishment of his quest, that of domesticating a sexually unruly female subject.
那这里我最后分析就是这个片段当中的音乐。那从这个片段最一开始到最后，那个就是逐渐变得越来越强的那个，就是听起来有一点令人毛骨悚然的那个传统音乐。事实上也是在如果做出一个比较的话，在最一开始Lan的出场所伴随的都是就是那个市井上人群或者是车子的那种噪音，也就是说意味着在那个时候Lan是一个重视物质的，所以他只听得到这个物质世界里面的噪音。但到了故事的发展，他逐渐接受了Hanh的这个道德价值之后，他也终于配得上就是传统的越南音乐的这样子的一个声音了。那所以这一场戏，他的声音随着他声音最后就是逐渐跟那个背景音乐融合在一起，他也就象征着他终于恢复了他本来那个内在的有美德的传统越南价值。那最后，我们前面有看到，就是他好几次拒绝，就Lan好几次拒绝Hanh要载他回家的这个提议。这个提议事实上也可以做出一个类比，也就是这个坚持，也就是Hanh 想要把烂重新带回传统家庭价值里面的一个类比，而到最后一场戏，他的那台Hanh的人力车停在烂的家门口，也象征着他终于就Hanh经过一番努力之后，终于把这个性生活放荡的娼妓重新带回家庭，重新驯化了。
So such a 180-degree turn makes me like suspect why is she portrayed as such an opinionated, strong-headed person, a very articulate person at the beginning, and then towards the end she just becomes voiceless. So it looks like she is portrayed that way at the beginning, only to embolden my successor, taming such a rebellious prostitute. It indeed appears that Tony Bui's approach to prostitution is to tame the prostitute, which reduces the problem of prostitution to a moral problem, that is, the morality of the prostitute. Maybe because Tony Bui did not live in Vietnam and did not experience firsthand the turbulences of the changes within the city, within the society, due to the country's economic reform, which was such a big deal to the Vietnamese, to the country. It afforded him a distance from the complex social structures within which prostitution is situated, the social structures that are beyond the problem of just morality. So what he adopted for his film is not grounded, it's not grassroots angle, but rather a paternalistic point of view to regard prostitution. Yet there are dangers within the ostensibly loving, restorative gaze that such looks can fetishize and silence, insisting on rewriting characters into narratives that suit the rescuer more than the rescued. 3 Seasons indeed focuses on Hanh path on rescuing Lan more than while overlooking Lan's journey of transformation and making it look like an apparent didactic tale rather than an exploration of the complexities of prostitution as a social problem. With 3 Seasons, Tony Bui treats prostitution ultimately as a moral decadence which can be solved by domesticating the prostitute, returning her back to her home, and restoring innocence and purity back into her.
所以这样子一个就是180度的转变，就是但它这个180度的转变，其实会让人觉得他一开始的那个就是他一开始那个外向那个能够表达意见的那个性格，是不是只是为了用来彰显就是Hanh这一个一连串的想要驯养这样子一个叛逆的娼妓的努力？那所以也就是说，从这一点我们可以看出来，就是裴东尼他在看性交易的观点。也是，他的观点是，就是要透过驯养，就透过驯化这一些娼妓来解决性交易的这个问题。也就是说，性交易是一个道德上的问题，要解决的就是娼妓他们本身的道德问题。那也许是因为裴东尼他没有在就是改革开放的那个混乱的那个越南社会快速改变的那个时间生活在越南，所以他可以采取一个比较疏离、比较远的一个观点来看待这个就是复杂的这个社会结构。那因为整个性交易其实是这个复杂的社会结构的一个结果，而不仅仅只是因为道德问题带来的。所以也就是说，他所看待这个问题的角度，并不是一个非常贴地、非常草根的观点，而比较是一个家父长制的一个观点。那但是，所以也就是说，这样子有一个危险，也就是如果这样子一个表面上充满了爱，而充满了就是修复性的一个凝视，事实上有可能是会让那个事实上可能是会带来一个物化的效果，会让一个他凝视的那个客体失去发言权的一个效果。所以这样子写成的一个故事，其实是一个关于拯救者的故事，而不是一个关于被拯救者的故事。那确实，《恋恋三季》它整个故事其实关注的是Hanh他怎么解救Lan的这一整个过程，所以我们其实从来没有看，所以他其实从来没有要去探索就是性交易或者是娼妓他们的内部的复杂性，或者是把他们看作一个社会问题。他 最后只是把这个问题看作一个道德上的堕落，然后需要透过把这些娼妓重新带回家庭来解决这些问题。
Alright, so Bui's stance on prostitution seems to align with the view that because prostitution is wrong, then prostitutes are inherently wrong. And what needs to be corrected is the corrupt nature of the prostitute woman. However, the patriarchal assumption that prostitution is a problem about women ensures that the other participant in the prostitution contract, that is the client, escapes scrutiny. Three Seasons indeed looks only at the prostitute to reconvert her without really scrutinizing the clients, or more importantly, the system in which prostitution is created and reproduced. In this film, the clients and the system are obscure elements in the prostitute's struggle. Her clients' faces are almost never shown. Like here, you can see that they are shown from very far away, so their figures are just visible, but their faces are not. Here is the closest shot of a client's face. And the system is only referred to generically as they, in Lan's words about rich people. They walk a different walk, talk a different talk. Also, the system is also shown through images of urbanization and modernization, as in the American billboards and construction sites. Meanwhile, in Wild Girls and Sweet Cinderella, the clients and the system are portrayed in much greater detail. As you can see here, the clients have conversations and they have closer, like close-up shots at their faces, and that's a pimp. Well, he's a man, but I think he identifies as a mama-san and not a pimp because he wears makeup, and he's called by the prostitutes as mama. There's another character in Street Cinderella, also a man, identifying himself as a mama-san. And there are the thugs, the violent gangsters, and the system also includes the more benevolent, lots of intellects here, and the press over there. And of course, the violent side, lots of gangsters and pimps and nonsense.
OK， 那所以李东尼他的立场其实就比较接近于，就是他认为性交易是错的，那所以这些娼妓也是错的。那要改正的方法就是通过改正这些娼妓他们的道德问题。那但是这样子一个父权的观点，其实忽略了这个就是性交易契约关系中的另外一方，也就是客人的那一方。那在恋恋三季的这个故事里面，他确实完全是只关注就是怎么回复娼妓的良善，而完全没有看到就是那个客人的那一边。尤其是更重要的是，他也完全没有关注到就是让性交易这件事情有可能发生的整个体系。那像是在刚的那个画面，在刚的那些画面里面，就是我们可以看到，像是那些客人们，他们都只有在远景的镜头里面出现，他们有被拍到，但是完全没有看到他们的脸到底是谁。而这个结构，这个性交易背后的这个体系，则只是用非常模糊的说，就是他们，或者是说用一些现代化、都市化的那些就是工地的场景啊，美国的招牌来指涉。而另外一方面，在黎皇的电影当中，我们就可以看到这些客人跟这些体系，他们是有非常多的细节被拍摄出来的。这些客人他们是就是有钱的商人，或者是一些就是谎称自己是就是海外越南人的人，而那个体系则包括这些就是像是在画面的左下的那种就是学者们，或者是画面中间的那些就是他们这些利益良善的学者或者这些媒体，还有另外一边当然就是那些坏心的皮条客那些妈妈桑，还有他们的背后的那些黑道。
Okay, 3 seasons on the left side is noticeably absent of the army of managers in the prostitute's life, such as pimps, mamasans, gangsters, and not even rival prostitutes. Lan suffers from none of these potentially malevolent forces. She does not have a pimp that would rob her of her income or claim possession of her body and her labor, and even her entire value as a person, like in Bargos and Street Cinderella. The prostitute in 3 seasons is free of such violence and violation, who acts by herself with her own autonomy. So altogether, Tony Bui's film projects a fairly smooth life for the prostitute. No pimp, good pay, luxurious hotels as working sites, as you can see. The room and then the gate of the hotels, they all look very nice. No one claims control of her money or her body. And her John, her customer, Hanh, he becomes her customer one time, but not to have sex with her, but to let her stay in a nice hotel room with air conditioning so that she can sleep peacefully for one night. And so her John wants to rescue her from prostitution and return her to safety. So she has quite a smooth life as a prostitute, as portrayed in 3 seasons. Her season, this film is called 3 seasons, right? So her season in 3 seasons is the color red, the color of passion and of struggle, but this struggle is an inner moral struggle rather than a physical struggle that is depicted very graphically and violently in Le Hoang's films.
那另外一方面，在《恋恋三季》当中，我们刚才所提到的就是这些管理娼妓的这些管理阶层，像是皮条客、像是妈妈桑、像是黑道这些人，在《恋恋三季》当中都是没有出现的，然后甚至也没有就是敌对的其他的娼妓，Lan完全是活在一个就是没有任何恶意没有任何恶意威胁的世界里面，他没有娼妓会剥削他的收入，然后也没有黑道会来就是声称拥有他身体的所有权。那不像是在舞女或是在街头灰姑娘当中，这些娼妓是活在一个非常的高压的情况之下。那所以在恋恋三季当中，恋恋三季当中的娼妓，它其实是完全拥有完全的自主性的。那所以也就是说，皮东尼他的电影所投射出来的是一个比较轻松、比较滑顺的娼妓的生活。那包括他没有皮条客，然后他的收入很好，他一个晚上可以赚$50，在1999年是一大笔钱。然后他的工作场所是在豪华饭店，然后他不会遭到暴力，也没有剥削，然后而且他还有就是有一个男人等着要来解救他。那在恋恋三季当中，就是恋恋三季它当然它有3个季节，那就是关于这个娼妓的季节是红色的，也就是热情跟冲突的颜色。但是这个冲突比较多是就是内在的道德冲突，而不是就是实际的身体上的那种暴力冲突，像是在帝皇电影当中所描述的那样子。
Thank you. Meanwhile, Bargos and Street Cinderella do not endow the prostitutes such freedom and to maneuver in their own space and at their own pace. They are hustled around to work any moment of the day when they are intoxicated and sick on the floor, when they are in the middle of a meal, when they are sleeping or taking care of their feverish baby. Their earnings is extracted from their persons by the omnipresent mamasans and their scary gangsters who beat them up until they submit their hard-earned money. It could be said that Le Hoang's films reflect a rougher and darker reality of the Vietnamese prostitutes in the early 2000s who operate amidst chaos and violence. Their misery and wretchedness are produced by the exploitative mamasans and their violent thugs. In such a brutal environment, eventually they have to just stand up for themselves, and in Bargos, they kill the mamasan. And also, Hanh also pled for help from the authorities at the end of the film. Would you like to do the translation first, and then we'll do the clip?
那在另外一方面，在就是舞女就是在李黄的作品当中，那他们这些娼妓就没有被赋予这么大的自由， 他们事实上他们生活是每天从早到晚都随时都是被推去工作的，不管他们是就是因为生病或者是因为吸毒瘫在地上，还是他们在吃饭或睡觉或照顾小孩到一半，他们可能就会被推去，他们都会被推去工作。那也就是说，我们可以说黎黄的电影它所反映出来的是一个比较黑暗、比较粗暴的2000年初期的越南的枪击的一个境况。他们的悲剧或者他们这些破败的生活条件，事实上是被这些剥削他们的妈妈桑，还有这些暴力集团所带来的。那在这种环境当中，他们最后能做的事情也就是只能要么他们诉诸暴力，像是在舞女当中，他们最后杀了那个妈妈桑，或者就是像是或者是要诉诸权威来寻求指引或者协助。
In this video clip, it's one of the violent scenes where Hoa is beaten up by gangsters who want her money.
那这一幕就是画被黑帮打，然后要他把钱交出来的场景。
Okay, another very important point about Bargos and Cinderella, Street Cinderella, is that let's just skip the next paragraph. Okay, let's just skip that one. I just would like to point out that Le Hoang, because he lived in Vietnam and he was grounded in such a society and a time of transitioning. So he developed a more grounded view of prostitution, and so this allows him. We skipped one paragraph. We moved on to the one on page 11. This allows him to view prostitutes from a rather grounded and diversified perspective. And so in his films, the prostitute is of course complex and subversive, as we talked about earlier, but it's also very significantly and optimistically very transformative. Here, okay. For example, by using the same actresses, this is Minh Thu who played Hanh in Bargos, and then she played, her name is also Hanh in Street Cinderella, but in this film, her occupation is not a prostitute anymore, she's an actress. And also this is, her name is Kiều Thanh, and she played a prostitute character in 2001 in a very popular TV series then. So she was a prostitute in another product, and she became a journalist in Bargos. So with these instances, Le Hoang transformed a prostitute into an actress and another prostitute into a journalist, who both try to help prostitute women and to understand them. But more importantly, the more spectacular transformation and metamorphosis in Le Hoang's films is this one, prostitute Hoa. Here in Bargos, we already established that she's very radical, very subversive, but in Street Cinderella, she is quite sacrificing, and she is very selfless in Street Cinderella. I know these are like very cliches, and I would agree that they're not very good cinema there, but we're talking about prostitution. So I'll show you a clip where in Street Cinderella, the subversive and radical Hoa in Bargos transforms into someone completely different. Here it is.
那刚才说的就是，虽然黎黄他对于娼妓的描写是非常多样，然后也非常具有叛逆、非常具有颠覆性的，但同时他也认为娼妓们是具有可变性的，所以在他运用这些演员的时候，他在他的两部电影之间，对于这些演员的身份的转换上，就非常有趣。比如说，在舞女当中饰演汉的那个演员，他在这个灰姑娘当中就改成饰演 就是那个要揣摩娼妓的那个女演员，然后在舞女当中的那个记者演员，也是本来在之前的越南的连续剧当中也是扮演娼妓的角色，也就是说他试图转换，就是让这些女演员成为能够支持，让这些女演员变在下一个作品当中扮演一个就是在支持娼妓的角色的这样的演员。那其中最有趣的是画这个角色，也就是在2部电影当中都有画的角色，然后他是用同一个演员，他是用了同一个演员同一个名字，但他们是有截然不同的个性。在街头灰姑娘当中，她是一个无私的自我牺牲的一个女性。
Okay, now I'd like to show you this clip where Lan, well, after she was beaten up by the gangsters, she's hospitalized, right, and she's in critical condition here. But her lover, the singer, needs a dancer. She's also a professional dancer who works in a bar for the cabaret, and so here she struggles to get up and go and be the dancer for her lover's concert. Alright, very melodramatic. So basically she struggles and she gets up and she goes to the concert and she performs. And then by the end of this performance, she collapses because she's exhausted. Right? There. And then he carries her off to the hospital again. Right, so by writing different fates and personalities for one prostitute in 2 films, that is Hoa, Le shows multiple and fluid ways of viewing prostitutes as well as Vietnamese women in transitioning times. Even though the characters have the same name and are played by the same actress, Hoa in Bargles and Hoa in Street Cinderella are vastly different characters, save their common occupation, of course. The former, Hoa in Bargles, is spoiled, subversive, and vindictive, while the latter is somewhat innocent, honest, and selfless. In Bargles, she purposefully infects men with HIV virus because they rape her. Well, she asked for drugs, and then in order to give her drugs, they rape her in exchange. So she has HIV, and she purposefully, infects them with HIV. Thus, in Le Hong's view, the prostitute is to be understood as someone with multiplicity, complexity, and transformability. Also, by resuscitating a dead prostitute from Bargles, spoiler alert, at the end of Bargles, Hoa is dead because she injects herself with fake drugs, and she's dead because of an overdose in fake drug. By resuscitating a dead prostitute from Bargles and making her a better version of herself in Street Cinderella, Le Hong cinematically offers the prostitute an opportunity to reconstruct her life, an opportunity that is unavailable for many sex workers in real life.
那通过黎黄的电影，它通过就是给予这些娼妓不同的命运，还有不同的人格特质。它所要展现出来的是一个，就是我们看待娼妓的一种多样的眼光，一种流动的眼光。那虽然说在这两个电影当中，就是他们是同一个名字、同一个演员嘛，但是他们是不一样的角色。画在舞女当中的角色是一个被宠坏的，是一个叛逆的，是一个有恶意的一个女生。她是有意识的在把她的艾滋病病毒传给那些就是用毒品来强暴她的那些男人。然后，但是在后面在街头灰姑娘这部电影当中，她变成一个无私的、诚实的，然后自我牺牲的一个形象。所以在黎黄的观点当中，就是这些娼妓们，他们是具有多层次的复杂性，他们是具有这样子的可变性的。而同样的，黎黄通过在就是在舞女当中，就是已经死掉的那个画， 他让他在街头会不良当中复活。通过这件事情，他也是用电影的方式来让这个娼妓获得一个就是可能许多性工作者在现实当中没有办法拥有的机会，也就是一个可以重建他生命的机会。
Okay, thank you. I think because of the time, so I'm going to skip a few points and then we'll move forward to, let's see, this is, okay, I'll just go through very quickly. This in Sweet Cinderella involves, besides all the points that we have discussed so far about multiplicity, complexity, and transformability of prostitutes, there is also an insistence on misconception of prostitution in Le Hoang's films. When he, for example, in Street Cinderella, there is a film crew. Like Street Cinderella is about a film crew trying to make a film about prostitution, and also about a real prostitute, which is Hoa, trying to be a normal girl and to love and to sacrifice for her lover. And then here is Hanh, the actress who tries, so she, in this scene, she hangs out with real sex workers so that she can understand and portray the prostitute's character better in her film. So there is an insistence and a repetition of the misconception, misunderstanding, and even bewilderment, no understanding of prostitution in Le Hoang's films. But let's skip that and move to, I think I'll just go through page 13, the last paragraph on page 13, so that we can have some discussion after this. It's rather long. So the last paragraph on 13, right? In contrast to Le Hoang's efforts to portray a contemporary Vietnam with all the dark colors and loud noises approaching cities underworld, Tony Bui's Three Seasons expresses an ultimate yearning for an imaginary past with a nostalgia that seeps through almost every aspect of the film. From the characters, for example, the very cultured and educated cyclo driver, this Hai, he's always with a book. Look at this. He's always with a book. When he's waiting for Lan on his cyclo, he's always reading a book, which is a self-help book that was published in 1962. And then there's another character who is an exiled leper poet who keeps dreaming of his youth and his young lover, a peasant girl, the good girl character, who is baffled by the new obsession with the inauthenticity of city people. And then there's also the designated colors here. For each season, as if seasons, the seasons in this film are just distant memories that remain as color impressions. And then there's a diegetic as well as background music, the traditional Vietnamese music, the folk songs. And of course the general slow pace of the film that reveals the desire to stall, to delay time. All of that express like a desire or a nostalgia for past tense Vietnam. As Tony Bui himself professed, Three Seasons was a search for an inner world of the Vietnamese, which in this case, a look inward is a look backward. As Vietnam in Tony Bui's mind is a past tense word, and a country where more than half of the population was not born at the time when the war ended. Three Seasons conjures up a past tense Vietnam through poetry. There's a poet, of course, there's poetry, folk music, references of past lives, and the general nostalgic desire for traditional beauty and values. There is a famous Vietnamese director named Doi Moi. I don't have anything about him. He says that for those filmmakers who are living and working in Vietnam, this search for the inner world of the Vietnamese doesn't exist because Vietnam is the environment of their daily life. Tony Bui looks for the first spring that feeds the beginning of the river, but we, Vietnamese directors, we are soaking in this river. So, to employ his metaphor, living among the very turbulent waves of rapidly changing society, Vietnamese filmmakers, including Le Hoang, those filmmakers that live in Vietnam, could only look forward to navigate through the roughness and turmoil of the new era, the era of the market economy that they experienced every day.
OK， 那因为时间的关系，所以我们这边要跳过几个段落。那这个几个段落，再说的其实就是黎煌他有一个他其实有一个坚持，就是他在他电影当中不断的在反问，就是我们对于性交易这一件事情的误解，或者对这件事情的偏见。那他主要有两个跟这个坚持有关的，也就是他在《街头灰姑娘》当中的他的故事当中有一个就是电影剧组他们在拍一部电影嘛。那这部电影在这个电影剧组他们就时常会就是在大叫在呼喊说我们完全不了解这些性工作者。那除此之外，也是在《街头灰姑娘》当中也是有这个就是有这个女演员，她在试图揣摩这些娼妓的时候，她不断的失败，而直到她最后跟这些娼妓就是实际上共同生活了一段时间之后，她才成功在就是荧幕上能够扮演娼妓这样的一个角色。那么现在我们就是跳到第13页的最下面这个段落。这个段落，在这里就是裴东尼的《烈焰三季》这部电影不像黎煌他在描述就是越南的在描述胡志明市的这个下层世界用的这种就是黑暗的用这种黑暗，然后用这种充满暴力的方式来描述，他所采取的是一种对于逝去的那个过往的那个想象中的过去的一种乡愁式的建构。那这包括他的角色的设计，比如说像是那个人力车夫，他是一个就很有教养的人力车夫，他随时都在看书。那比如说像是还有就是一个被流放的一个汉生病的一个诗人，然后或者是一个在城市当中就是迷失的一个乡下的女孩。还有就是那除此之外，这个乡愁的意涵也可以从就是这个它的地面三季这3个颜色的分配来看，就是在那个荧幕上面的现在的右下，就是这些颜色都表现出一个就是这个故事是一个已经是一个很久以前的过去，然后已经是属于过去式的那个越南的一些记忆，还有就是那些他所使用的这些民俗音乐，还有就是他在这电影当中我们刚看到的那些就是慢动作来表示就是过往的时间是流动的是很慢的流动的方式。所以就像裴东尼他说的，他的这部电影所要试图要做到的事情是寻找就是越南的内在世界。那所以也就是说，如果从他这样根据这个说法的话，往内看就是往后看的意思。裴东尼他在裴东尼心中，越南是一个过去式的字眼。这个他为了重现这个过去式的越南，所以他用了这些诗，用了这些民俗音乐，这些过去的生活方式的这些指涉，还有这些传统的美的这些再现。就像有一个越南的名导演叫做邓南明，他就这样子评论这部电影，他说对于这些在越南生活工作的电影制作人来说，像是裴东尼这样子的寻找是不存在的，因为裴东尼所要寻找的是这一条就是越南这条河流的源头，但是对于这些在这里生活的电影人来说，他们是快要被这条河流淹死的人，也就是在越南的这一些电影制作人，包括像黎煌，他们都是在这个就是快速变迁的这个市场经济的时代当中，就是努力在寻求能够幸存下来的人。
Alright, so in her critique of Three Seasons, Janet said that by granting the sequel driver the overseeing perspective throughout the film, Three Seasons sees Vietnam through a Vietnamese perspective instead of acquiescing to the American and Western colonial and imperialist gaze of Vietnam. And this is true. Three Seasons indeed debunks the widely publicized cliches of Vietnam and Vietnamese people in Hollywood and Western cultural products, especially the films, Hollywood films about the Vietnam War. The cliches of the ignorant savage, the soulless murderer, or the wanton whore. So here are some of the photos. This one is from The Deer Hunter, where the Vietnamese are portrayed as horrible people who are like. I remember feeling very angry when I watched this scene, the Russian roulette scene, where the Vietnamese people are portrayed as just murderers and savages and actually enjoying killing people. This is the Green Berets, I think, yes, the Green Beret, and the Vietnamese are portrayed as pretty much naive and ignorant people who, of course, need help of the Americans. And here is a very iconic prostitute character in Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. I think there are actually projects that are based on this prostitute character in Kubrick's film. So, indeed, Three Seasons presents something else rather than these stereotypical images of the Vietnamese in an American film. That's why it was very significant for the Vietnamese American community in the US. The film is appreciated for bringing a de-Americanizing perspective and negotiating a new kind of relation between Vietnam and America, a relation in which the defeated, the American, comes back to colonize the winner with economic forces. Nevertheless, by announcing Three Seasons or any other cultural product simply as Vietnamese, while in fact it is Vietnamese American, or Vietnamese Australian, or Vietnamese French, and these products are forged from the perspective and experience of Vietnamese ethnic people living in these countries, in their complex and diverse feelings towards Vietnam, including perhaps nostalgic, nonchalant, yearning, or even just very resentful for lots of reasons. Some scholars unknowingly neglect the history of not only overseas Vietnamese but also Vietnamese people living inside Vietnam. And more problematically, by using the indiscriminate and overarching term Vietnamese without further clarification for Vietnamese people living in the US or in the West, American centrism and Western centrism are actually reproduced instead of being subverted as intended, I believe. So, this presentation, this is the final slide. Oh, shall we have the translation, please?
在 Janice 他对于《恋恋三季》的评论当中，他说，通过这个人力车夫，通过他的眼睛来描述这个故事，其实是一个让越南人的故事可以摆脱过去的西方或者是美国的那种传统刻板印象的一个创举。OK， 那这样说是没错的。《恋恋三季》它确实是揭穿了过去就是好莱坞大量在描绘的那种越南人的刻板印象，包括他们可能是那种就是一直在杀人的，就是他们一直在杀人的那些野蛮人，要么就是那种很天真很无知的野蛮人，或者是像在金甲部队当中，他那个就是越南女性就是那种荡妇的形象。那所以也就是说这一部电影《恋恋三季》这一部电影，它其实是一个在就是从战后以来，算是一个重新在跟越南跟美国关系重建的一个象征。那但是如果我们把所有的不管他是美籍越南人或法籍越南人或澳洲籍越南人的作品都全部视为是越南的，那我们其实忽略了这个就是在这些离散越南人跟这些本土越南人他们之间的差别，还有这些离散越南人他们可能在不同的文化环境当中所产生的对越南的那些不同的情感，他们有人可能是很思慕的、很思念的，也有可能是不关心的，甚至有一些人是对于越南是感到憎恨的。而更有问题的当然是，如果我们这样无差别的使用越南的这样子的一个概念，来指涉这些无论是住在美国或住在西方的这些越南人，那我们其实是在生产这个美国中心主义或者是西方中心主义这样子的概念，而不是在对这些概念提出挑战。
So this is the second last slide. So in this presentation, I have discussed how the different perspectives of the two filmmakers, Vietnamese domestic Le Hoang and Vietnamese American Tony Bui, informed them to construct vastly different cinematic realities for prostitution and sex workers in Vietnam in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I have argued that that Three Seasons conceptualizes prostitution from a moral point of view, and speculated that this is perhaps due to Tony Bui's unfamiliarity compared to Le Hoang with the unfolding reality of Vietnamese society under Doi Moi, under renovation. To be fair to Bui, though, the story of the prostitute only makes 1/4 of his entire film, so it is perhaps a very pragmatic and practical decision to just establish a moral aspect in viewing prostitution rather than spending time and space to explore prostitution as a social problem. On the other hand, as Le Hoang was grounded in and deeply affected by Doi Moi, as I presented earlier, Barbels and Street Cinderella view prostitution and its consequences, such as the epidemic of HIV/AIDS, as bounded in the larger context of Vietnam in transitioning from a socialist society to a market economy. The sex industry, thus, is portrayed as a brutal scene of oppression, violence, and exploitation, and is a conundrum that requires more research and less assumption.
所以我今天的发表讨论了在1990年代末期到2000年初期，这两位就是黎煌跟裴东尼这两位分别代表本地跟离散的观点，他们在看待越南社会当中的性交易跟性工作者的这些不同的看法。那我强调的是，恋恋三季它事实上把整个性交易限缩概念化为一个道德的观点，然后并且这可能是因为裴东尼他本身对于那个时期，越南正在改革开放的那个快速变动的社会的现况不熟悉，所以他才能够采取一个比较疏离的角度来看。但是当然就是也有可能就是因为他的这个在裴东尼的电影里面，这个关于娼妓的这个季节其实只占了就是3个季节的1/3，也就是说他有可能也是因为要用一个比较务实的方式，所以他做了一个比较简单的描写，把它放到道德议题上去。那另外一方面，像黎煌，他则是因为他的整个生命轨迹跟着越南社会的这个改革开放，并平行的前进，所以他在他的电影当中，不论是舞女或者是街头灰姑娘，他在描写性交易跟性交易的这些性交易的这些结果，比如说艾滋病的时候，他都是把它放到一个比较大、比较宏观的越南政治经济现况当中。那所以他所描写出来的这个性产业是一个充满了压迫、充满了剥削的一个很恶劣的环境，并且同时它也是一个受到非常多的误解，需要我们做更多研究、更多理清的一件事情。
And that was the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your immense patience and perhaps a little bit of interest today. Thank you very much.
Han's very, very interesting and insightful analysis of the 3 films. And now it's 8:15. So we are supposed to end this today's event at night, maybe a little bit past 9. So I think we still have like 45 minutes to 50 minutes for discussions, and we hope that we can have another 10 minutes or so to open the floor for your questions. So let's invite Professor Gross up first to give a 5 to 7 minutes of discussions of the presentation, and then we'll go to Professor Hanh.
OK， 我们的那个活动因为大概会在9点之前结束，所以我们接下来会先让就是2位老师做出回应，然后之后我们会开放 Q&A 的时间。
Thank you. Very briefly, because I think we should students a chance to ask their questions. So, okay, only 2 questions, let's say. Comment and question. First, on, let's say, general issue, I would like to ask you your opinion on the continuities and discontinuities in the history of prostitution in Vietnam, taking into consideration that there is something very special in that context, Vietnam, concerning what the, let's say, the basic differences between colonial prostitution, that is prostitution at the time of the French in Vietnam, then what I would call war prostitution, that is the American war at that time, and then, okay, you say prostitution, but should it not be called more precisely Doi Moi prostitution, what you are talking about, what you are dealing with in your research? So what are the continuities? What are discontinuities? In my opinion, each of them is a continent. It's a special, it's an object, a very special object. So maybe there is some sort of an illusion of continuity. And what we should deal more precisely with are the discontinuities between the object. Because when you mention Kubrick's film, that scene, in Kubrick's film, I think you miss something. You say, okay, it's about the cliché, the American clichés on the Vietnamese prostitute. But it's not only that. When you look in detail at that scene, it's all about the context, I mean, within the realm of the American war. You have many things involved in it. And in particular, in this scene, there's something involved in it, which is the relationship between the black and the white soldiers. Because it's about the prostitute who doesn't want to go with the black soldier for reasons which I don't want to deal with because it's okay. So that would be my first question about these different, let's say, features of different sequences of prostitution. And I think that for your research, it's maybe of some importance because it matters, let's say, in genealogical terms, that background. So if you don't only want to rely on, let's say, presentist approach of the problem, that is how it looks today, only cut from the background, historical background, you have to take into considerations these matters, I mean, the genealogical perspective. Okay, that would be the first issue. The second issue of, I agree with you that finally the two Vietnamese films are more interesting than the American Vietnamese film. Okay, if you, I mean, the audience here, if you have a chance to look at the 3 films, you probably will find that the 3 Seasons is more interesting. It's a better film. But why? Because, of course, that Vietnamese American director, guy, has made his own Western codes in filming, in shooting. He's a Westerner, basically, he's a Westerner, and he makes a Western film. Okay, he's familiar with Vietnam, of course, he's not a complete outsider, but basically what he makes is a Western film. And for that reason, you will be very familiar with all the codes in the film, and you say, oh, okay, good. When you look at 2 Vietnamese films, you say, oh, the dialogues are so poor. The light, the sound, most often the acting, playing it so. Yes, because it's another part of the world, another way. I mean, the people have not been trained the same way, as simple as that. Not the same schools, etc., etc. But precisely for this reason, I find that these two films are more interesting because they are not so good from our angle of view. So what I wanted to ask you is, for us Westerners, there is a very familiar picture, let's say taking Hollywood as a general pattern. If that's, let's say, all what concerns transgression, subversion, things which are dangerous matters, all this, when we talk about filmmaking, is more or less soluble in commerce, business, and it becomes very easily just filmic commodities. Pictures, just pictures. Okay, so you mentioned that, so there is something like that in the two films by Le Hoang. Because, okay, he shoots that film at the time, which is a turning point, right, in the history of Vietnamese cinema. So, what is, of course, remarkable, or has to be noticed in these films, is that they show, they deal with things which could not be dealt with before, right? So the Vietnamese filmmakers had to shoot films on the war and the building of socialism. And then all of a sudden comes a guy who makes a film on all these very contentious issues like AIDS, prostitution, drugs, and shows that rather, let's say, bluntly. So it's new. But it's new, okay, and he makes a hit, so this is why he can make a second film after that. But maybe all this has some sort of a brief of just pretense, it's an appearance. I mean, the subversive dimension. You seem to somehow to stick to it, insisting on some scenes where, I mean, the feminist interpretation can be put forward. But from the other angle, you can say, oh, it's just a new way of selling new things to the audience in a new era when the market becomes dominant. So for cinema, like for other things, for movie making, like for other things. So the question would be, is it exactly that? Does it happen exactly the same way as in the West, in that context? That is how transgression, subversion become commodities. That would be the question. Because he said, the guy said, I found an article, the film director said, so why did you do, the question is, why did you do that? Oh, the only answer is that I did a film which the audience wants to see. But this is very ambiguous, what the audience wants to see. Entertainment, or because the audience wants to deal with these issues which are critical for society, or both of them, just both of them. So I would like to have your comment on these two issues. Thank you.
OK， 好，那我的提问会尽量短一点，让就是把机会留给学生们发问。那我今天的问题主要有两个方面，第一个是一个在比较普遍的一个层面，也就是说，在越南的 越南性交易这个产业的历史脉络的这个问题，就是因为从过去也就是有所谓的殖民的性交易，也就是在法国殖民的时期，那也有所谓战争性交易，也就是在越战的这个时期。那当然还有就是今天演讲在说的这个就是改革开放的这个性交易的时期。那在这三者之间，就是他们的连续性应该要怎么样被看待？他们之间的连续性是真的有这样的连续性吗？还是他们就是有完全不一样的关系？那刚才因为你提到就是库伯利克的《金甲部队》这部电影，然后你说那部电影当中，就是因为那是一个越战背景的电影，然后在里面的越南的女性越南的娼妓的描绘。事实上，在那部电影当中，它其实是有它的战争脉络的，也就是那部电影是关于就是黑人士兵跟白人士兵在越南的时候碰到的问题。那这个东西我们现在没有要深入的讨论，但是我要问的问题就是，那么就是如果你要讨论这个改革开放这个时期的性交易的话，那么你要怎么处理就是过去在历史上殖民的时期、战争的时期的这个系谱？那第二个问题则是，我某种程度上我同意你说，我同意你说的，就是国内的，就是因为今天的这两部电影分别代表一个国内的视野，一个就是国内的视野跟一个离散的视野嘛。那我同意你说的，就是国内的，也就是黎煌的作品是比较好的作品。那但是我要说的事情是，如果今天在座的观众都看过这三部电影的话，你们非常有可能会觉得。那个《念念三季》这部电影是一个比较好的电影，那但是原因是因为这个裴东尼他就是一个，他其实可以算是，他基本上就可以算是一个美国人，他所拍摄电影的方式就是一种西方电影拍摄的方式，所以我们之所以可能觉得《念念三季》会比较好，是因为我们非常习惯于它的元素，非常习惯于他说故事的方式。那我们再一看，所以我们现在如果立刻开始来看，就是黎煌的这两部电影，我们可能会觉得很无聊，因为我们并没有被训练我们并没有训练成用这样子的方式来看电影。那所以也是正是因为这个原因，所以我才会觉得黎煌的电影反而是一个比较好的电影。那所以我的问题，那接下来就是我的第二个问题，也就是说，因为你说就是黎煌拍摄的这两部电影，在整个电影的越南史上，它是一个转折点，也就是从过去。社会主义电影，我们只能拍社会主义的事情，或者是拍战争的事情。来到现在，我们可以拍商业电影，可以拍这一些毒品或者这些性交易的这样子的主题的时候，你说这一件事情本身是一件具有颠覆性的，然后尤其是在黎煌的电影当中，他所描绘的那些女性的形象，但那些具有颠覆性反叛的女性的形象。你说，就你不断的在强调这个颠覆性，但是我也想要问，就是会不会这个东西也其实就是一个他们试图这是一个就是可以吸引观众来买单的一个元素。那这之间的差异，我们要怎么来辨识呢？那所以我其实也看了一些越南电影的报道。那在一些访谈里面也会有问到，就是黎煌说为什么你会这么做？你为什么会拍这些电影？那这些越南导演他们也回答，就是我就是为了观众来拍这些电影的，而我为了观众拍这些电影，其实是一个很模糊的一个回答，因为观众是为了要娱乐来看这些电影，还是因为观众他们也确实在这个时代当中，他们也同时也确实有一些开始对于现况的批判性的思考的。
的翻译真的很厉害。Okay, next we'll move on to Professor Hanh. Yeah, please limit it to like 5 minutes.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Well, this is the first time I see this presentation in this movie. I liked your discussion and your analysis about the film by Tony Bui talking about moral issue. And then Le seeing it more as a social issue. I thought that was quite spot on, and I think it was quite interesting. But I was actually wondering a little bit, so I'm a historian, so I'm looking for data and I'm looking for facts and I'm trying to see. So I was kind of wondering, it seems to me, and I would like to echo a little bit what Alan already said. So the film is actually the American Westerner seems to be more like telling a sort of a story going back to an ideal society. But I was actually thinking, basically, how can I put this in a easy way? Who actually is the audience? So, for instance, the movie that was made by the American, is that movie also popular in Vietnam? And the movie made by Le is probably directed at the audience in Vietnam, right? So in that sense, they must both have a different message because their audience is different, right? So in your analysis, are you taking that into account? It seems to me that that makes a big difference. And what is the goal of the movie? Is it to entertain or is it more like to teach? And in that sense, it seemed to me like the movie by Le seems to be showing a little bit of critique for capitalism and then basically saying, look what happened to our beautiful society and people have lost their way. So there's like a social issue in the sense that they're trying to depict the terrible situation that has happened, and there must be some kind of answer. So I'm actually quite interested in what the Vietnamese authorities were thinking of those movies. Because of course Vietnam is still quite a society with strict controls and things like that, so that must be interesting as well. Whereas the American movie seemed to me also a little bit, like you mentioned yourself in your analysis, you only showed 1/4 or 1/3 of the movie. So in that sense, the story is not really complete, right? Because you're showing a story, but you're only showing the little elements, and you're analyzing only that. Whereas if we look at a story, we should look at what the whole story is the director is trying to say, right? Looking at only one lens seems to be a bit unfair. So that also seems to have some kind of impact, but it seems pretty clear that he's saying, well, the right way is to abandon prostitution or maybe to go back to moral values. So that was really interesting, like you said in your analysis. The one element seems to be more individualistic, the woman has a choice, and in the other it's more like society is responsible for the mess. And then maybe my final question is, or my last point is, it seems also interesting because I wonder how much we can deduce. Because you're seeing your analysis very much focused on prostitution, but the lady there that was burning the dollar bill, for instance, it could also be like choices that are made by the Vietnamese people. So is it really prostitution per se, or is it more like we're Vietnamese, our society is being transformed, how are we going to deal with it?
Frank 的问题主要是就是他说，因为我是一个历史学家，所以其实我对于你的分析，我对于你的分析，包括就是裴东尼他在看待性交易的问题，从一个道德层面上来看，然后李煌从一个社会议题的层面上来看的这个观点，我也相当同意。但是我是一个历史学家，所以我其实想要知道的一些更多的是关于档案、关于事实的一些问题，比如说。裴东尼的电影，它是一部美国电影嘛，所以他在他的故事当中，他在寻找一个理想性的社会啊，但是所以说这部电影他所锁定的观众到底是美国的观众还是在越南的观众呢？这个可能也会对它的意义上产生不同。而在另外一方面，黎煌的案例当中，当然比较确定的就是，因为他所锁定的当然就是越南的观众。那么我也会想要知道，他所拍摄这个电影的目标是作为一种娱乐，还是他有某一些就是教育的不是道德教育，教育的成分在里面。 那因为黎黄他在他的电影当中当然是批评了就是这些资本主义社会的这些发展的有这样子的一些成分，所以我也会想要知道在那个时候越南的当局他们是怎么样看待黎黄的这一些作品的。OK， 那所以那也当然就是另外一方面也是因为你说到就是念念三季它其实有三个部分，然后你今天做的分析主要是根据其中关于就是娼妓的这个部分，那么也就是说，所以我认为这个分析它可能是还不够完整的，因为我们可能需要知道整个电影的结构，那我们才能够知道到底在这当中，在这个电影当中的这个性交易的这个部分到底代表什么样子的意义？那另外的一个问题，也就是说，我们可以，因为今天我们的主题是关于性交易，也就是在这些电影当中的性交易的这个层面。那但是我想要问的问题是说，我们可以就是把问题简化到什么样子的一个程度呢？也就是说，性交易它可能不是一个单一的现象，它可能是根源到整个社会结构的问题，所以它也有可能性交易有可能也不是它不是单独的现象，它是这个社会当中的这些越南人他们做出来的选择，所以也就是说，那这整个社会结构的问题。跟这个性交易之间的关系，我们应该要怎么来做简化
Okay, so I just have some simple questions for you. This first one is about the film title, 3 Seasons, because when I use some film reviews, I saw that some people consider the 3rd season as a season of hope. So I don't know how do you interpret this 3 seasons, because we understand that in Vietnam they kind of distinguish season from like hot and hotter according to Vietnamese students. So why the film is called 3 seasons, the 3rd season? Could you explain a little bit more of that? And the second question is maybe it's more broad about. I'm just curious about how Tony Bui's films challenge the Western-centric ideology, as you mentioned about that. It's actually contributed to that, and although you argue that maybe it should add like Vietnamese American or Vietnamese Australian to emphasize the ethical difference from the local native Vietnamese living in Vietnam. So I just want to read, I totally agree with Professor Bozak that Tony Bui's films can also be considered a Western film. But when you show those very cliched images of how those Vietnamese women were portrayed in American films, I totally agree that Tony Bui's film bring up the new images of the Vietnamese people. But still, I still don't understand how that films, not just the pictures and photos, but also the ideology, the messages that the film brings to the audience. How does it challenge the Western-centric ideology? Since we can see in Tony Bui's films, the prostitution is also a morally bad thing, right? And finally has to be restored back to the traditional good one. So could you explain a little bit more about this? And this question is related to my next questions about the concepts of nostalgia in Tony Bui's films, and also its absence in Le Huang's film. Because you mentioned, I think it's very interesting to see how you kind of distinguish. I'm not talking about the clear-cut distinction, but some of the blurred boundaries between the sporadic views versus the domestic view. And I think it's quite interesting. You look at the domestic view. You showed that from Le Huang's film, but I'm just quite curious if there are other films that also that shows the nostalgia for the old days. As we know that for example, people from North Vietnam would hold a different political views, or other, I don't know, from the South, from people from South Vietnam towards like the war and memory, things like that, trauma and etc. So I just wondering if, in addition to, because you mentioned that Le Huang's film doesn't really look back, except for the good days. So they just kind of look for the survival strategies, right, in current situation. But I just wondering, because if you look at the cinema in China, people do looking for good days during the socialist era. So I just wondering if you can provide more information about that, about the Australia for the old days. Okay, I think that's my three. I don't know how many questions I go about, but to reduce the interpreter's work, I can do Chinese by myself. Okay. 所以我第一个问题是关于那个页面3季这个电影的 title， 因为我看了一些网络上的对这个电影的评论，他讲到说这个第3个季节其实是一个season hope， 是一种希望的季节，因为其实它在尾巴每一个故事的尾巴，它都展现了一种希望，不管那个希望对我们来讲是什么哦。那所以我的问题是因为根据我的越南学生就是他们告诉我说，北越跟南越的季节不一样，但是基本上呢只有热的季节跟更热的季节，所以到底是什么是第3个季节？我希望就是听听这个我们的讲者怎么样解释这个问题。那我的第二个问题是比较是关于这个黑东尼他的电影怎么样去挑战这种西方中心主义的意识形态？因为其实刚刚这个罗萨教授也已经提到了，就其实这个东西是黑东尼的电影其实非常的西方视角，对。那所以我基本上我蛮同意这样的观点，我就比较好奇是在讲者的概念里面，他的电影除了这种影像不同于以前的那种非常陈腔滥调的影像的再现之外，它的意识形态或者它的任何其他的讯息有没有带出什么是真的可以挑战这种西方中心主义？所以可能我们要更进一步要问的是什么是西方中心主义。So maybe I just add a little bit about that. I have for a second questions about the Western centralism, because I think that maybe we should also further ask what you mean by Western centralism in your understanding of this film. 所以这个问题呢，就延伸到我第3个问题方面，我想了解一下，就是关于我们讲这种怀旧，就对那种旧时代的怀念。为什么想到这个问题？因为在讲者提到就是有一个侨民的观点，就是一个离散的观点 versus 对相对一个国内的观点。那我觉得这个东西很有意思，因为当我们在讲这种离散的观点的时候，我们可以讲到美国侨民或者那叫什么美国越南美国人，越裔美国人，或是越裔澳洲人等等。但是当我们在讲越南，在讲国内的观点时，我们似乎就只有一种越南人。那但是就我来讲，我以我的认知，像北越南越的观点，人民的观点，可能对越战或者对这些战争历史可能有不一样的想法跟诠释。所以在这个方面，我们怎么样？我比较好奇有没有其他的电影是真的会展现这种对旧时代的怀念，就像我们在看中国的电影当中，也很多人对这种社会主义时代的怀念，用这种怀念来挑战现在的这种市场经济。OK， 那我大概的问题是这样。I think we should have our speaker response to these questions and comments first, and if we have time left, we'll open the floor to more questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting but also very difficult questions to answer here. I think perhaps I should start with Professor Dong's questions because they are also a little bit connected to Professor Prasat's questions. So maybe I should start with that. because they are also contextual questions. So, all right. First of all, who is the audience of these films, right? So, for the two films by Le Hoang, of course, the primary audiences were Vietnamese people living inside Vietnam. The films were never brought to like a film festival, international film festival anywhere. So they outside of Vietnam, they are only available in the form of DVDs. But primarily the audiences were Vietnamese people living in Vietnam. And so I think it's a good thing to mention. And also, what is the purpose, right, of the films? There are a lot of interviews, like Professor Prasad said that he read an interview where Le Hoang said that his purpose of making Bagels was to make a film that the audience actually wants to see. So, and what does that mean? Because in the 1990s and early 2000s, the Vietnamese movies, as I mentioned earlier, were very unpopular with Vietnamese people because of the insistence on making socialist, realist films about the war and about socialist building, socialist society building, basically. There was an insistence on making these films. Doi Moi started in 1986, but the cinema, that means that people could earn private businesses, but the film industry was not privatized until 2002. Because apparently the cinema is an apparatus for the state. So they didn't let that happen until later in 2002. And so in the 1990s, films were still about the war and about socialist building, and the people, especially the younger generations, were growing tired of these films. So they did not go to the cinema just to see these films anymore. So I think Le Hoang wanted to make a film that the young people could relate to and wanted to see. So maybe that's what he meant. And also at the same time, he also said that there was a disease among Vietnamese artists that they tried to avoid talking about money and making money because the socialist society that just ended in 1986, in that society, making money was looked down upon, right? It was like a petty bourgeois behavior, so that was not encouraged at all. But he wanted to do something different because after Doi Moi, he wanted to make money and to draw the audiences back to the movies. I think that's why he made this movie with all the violence and the young people and the women's bodies, right? But that leads to the point of, I think, I'm mixing. Oh, okay. Let's just. What did the authorities think about Le Hoang's films? That's a very good question. These films actually started out. The production company was Giải Phóng Studio, which is still a state enterprise. And this film actually was a contract for Le Hoang to make actually a propagandistic film about the epidemic of HIV/AIDS. And to put this into context, in 1990s and 2000, the epidemic of HIV/AIDS was rampant in Vietnam, and the people and the state started to be very concerned about this epidemic, and they wanted a film that was about this. And it started out as actually the original name was The Case of Hanh, the name of the prostitute, and that name sounds like a police, like a name that the police have for a case, a criminal case, right? But Le Hoang changed that, and he, instead of making a holy propaganda film, he made this one. It's also, there's the authority, but the authority in this film actually fails to protect the younger people from prostitution and from the epidemic of HIV/AIDS. So that's the context of the film. Right. I think the purpose of the film was both to warn people about the epidemic, but also to entertain them, to keep them interested in Vietnamese cinema. And so, yeah, but I think, which leads to the point that Professor Prasad made about whether it is the feminists' subversiveness in Le Hoang's films. You could see the multiplicity, complexity, and transformability of the prostitute figure in Le Hoang's films as feminists, right? As women's empowerment. But at the same time, as you pointed out, that it could also be perceived only as like a gimmick, exactly that what he was, Le Hoang was criticized for. It's just a gimmick of using women's bodies to sell the films, right? So yeah, that's a very good point, and if that is the case, then it's anti-feminist, because the films used women's bodies to sell. Like you can see that the prostitutes are like, they barely have cover their bodies, right? So that's a very good point, and I will take that into my research. Thank you very much for that. And okay. All right, and another point that Professor Prasad made earlier was about the continuity and discontinuity of prostitution in Vietnam throughout, from the French colonial era in the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, and how prostitution in that era, and so in the war era between 1955 and 1975, where the of course wherever the American military bases go, there is prostitution. So of course the prostitution then was in the south, not the north, because North Vietnam then was socialist, a socialist society under communist leadership. There is no documentation that I could find about prostitution in the north during that time. But in the south, prostitution was rampant because even the South government, the South Vietnam government, even they thought, even though prostitution was not legal during the war, but it was let happen by the government, by the South Vietnam government, because one of the leaders actually said that the Americans need girls, we need dollars, then why not? Just go and sell yourselves. And so, and here in my research, I actually focus on prostitution in Doi Moi. But of course I have to like contextualize and put everything together in order to, to understand this social problem through time, and not just in this particular time with different structures, social structures, but also throughout history. And I think that's. I actually didn't hear a question, but there was more like comments. So yeah, I will put that into post consideration and into my research. And also, prostitution under colonial French era was very regulated, very strictly regulated. There is lots of literature on prostitution in the north of Vietnam then. Not so much in the south, but lots of literature on northern Vietnamese prostitution, and they all agree that prostitution then was very highly regulated by the colonial regime, and one of the reasons was that to protect the colonizers, to protect the health and the well-being of the French soldiers and the European soldiers in Vietnam at the time. And so the Vietnamese prostitutes had to be regulated. And I think something interesting is that there was a song, like when I read about this, there was a song that was popular among French soldiers at the time about how Indochina was a sex paradise. And meanwhile, in Vietnam, among Vietnamese prostitutes at the time, there was a song that taught them to protect themselves from venereal disease, from STIs. So it's something interesting. While the white colonizers enjoyed sex, the native women suffered from prostitution. And then, of course, there was prostitution during the war in South Vietnam. But yeah, I would put all that into my research for sure. What else was there? Oh yeah. Did I answer like all of Professor Don's and Professor Buza's questions? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So
I just wondering if we should allow the translation.
oh yes.
It's very long.
OK， 那我首先会先回答就是董凡老师的问题，因为他的问题也跟就是卜萨老师的问题有一些相关。那首先是关于就是这些电影他们的受众的问题。黎皇的这两部电影，它基本上可以说是完全是锁定国内的观众的作品，因为这两部电影都没有参加任何的国际影展，然后后来他们发行 DVD 之后，也基本上是留在国内的市场当中的。那另外一个问题就是对于就是这些电影他们所想要达到的目标是什么？那我会说确实就是像是博萨老师他在一些就是报道的访谈当中看到的，就是黎皇拍这些片子是为了观众。那我要说的是，就是因为在其实90年代末到2000年初期这个时间，越南电影其实对于越南的观众来说是非常难看，是非常不流行的。然后因为其实虽然1986年从1986年就已经开始改革开放，但是电影产业的私有化要一直到2002年才会开始。所以也就是说，在那之前，虽然已经改革开放，但是电影还是都是一些关于社会主义的题目，关于战争的题目。那因此，在当时对于年轻人来说，就这些电影是没有越南年轻人会进到戏院去看这些电影的。那也是所以黎皇他拍摄这些电影的其中一个目的，也是因为他想要拍一些就是现在的越南人会想要看的电影。那所以当然就是这跟赚钱的目标是有关系的。而赚钱这件事情，则是黎皇他试图想要做出来的另外一个挑战，也就是因为在当时在黎皇拍电影的那个时期，大部分的电影导演，他们都还是非常忌讳就是讲到钱，因为在过去社会主义的时代，就是讲到钱，想要赚钱这种事情是非常的布尔乔亚的，非常的资产阶级的一种说法。所以黎皇透过他的电影，他也是试图想要做出一个这样子的挑战。那董凡老师的另外一个问题则是就是那当局就是越南当局他们是怎么看待这些片子的？那其实事实上这些片子就是尤其是黎皇的这两部片子，它的制片公司其实在当时都还是国营企业。那甚至像是舞女这部片子，它甚至是一个，因为在当时越南开始在大力的在防疫艾滋病，所以其实这部片子在一开始还是艾滋病的这个预防计划的其中一个部分。所以本来舞女这部片子的片名是叫做就是汉的个案，就是韩的个案。然后后来被黎皇就是改成现在的名字，然后让它不再是一个纯粹的一个就是政令宣导片这样子。所以总结来说，就是这两部片子，它们确实是同时具有这样子的一个就是一些教育意涵，也同时具有一个就是想要吸引年轻人再重新回到电影院当中的这种娱乐的目标的。然后回答就是博萨老师的问题，因为博萨老师刚才问到的是， 在电影当中大量运用的这些就是女性的反叛的这些东西，他们到底是不是有就是在他们是有批判意义，他们是批判意义上的，还是他们是同时也其实是非常就是具有娱乐性，非常吸引眼球的。那确实我们从这个角度来看的话，我们可以说这个对于就是因为黎皇当时他的电影同行批评他为就是这种东西是一些廉价伎俩，然后用这种性、这种暴力、这种毒品这种东西来就是骗观众啊。所以刚才汉说的是，就是这个观点其实从这个角度来看的话，其实是一个非常的就是反女性主义的一个观点，而不只是一个就是单纯的电影批评。那最后是关于就是这个就是越南的性交易的这个历史上的这个延续性的问题，也就是那确实在就是19世纪晚期到20世纪中期的这个法国殖民的这个期间，到就是1955年到1975年的在越战的这个期间，他们之间的性交易的那个情况是不同的。在越南的在就是法国殖民的这个时期，在越南的性交易是高度的被管制，是有非常良好的管制的。他们是服务于就是这些殖民的官员、这些殖民的势力，然后所以因此他们为了不要让这些人就是为了不要让这些殖民者轻易染上性病，所以他其实是有非常全面的对于性交易的管制。但是同时所以也有一首法语，所以也有一首在就是法国士兵之间流传的一首法语歌，就是在讲说，就是印度支那是一个女人的天堂。同时也有一首就是越南的歌曲在讲，就是要越南的女人们怎么就是避免性病产上升。所以这之间其实也有一个比较的关系，就是殖民者性交易对于在殖民阶段的时候，性交易是一个就是对于殖民者来说，就是他们只要爽就好，然后这些后果全部都会是留给就是这些越南的女人来承担。那当然就是所以在法国殖民的这个期间，就是关于越南的性交易，其实有非常多文献，非常多就是被写进文学作品里面的结果。那到了就是在越战的这个期间，就是越战的时候，就是性交易基本上是只局限在就是南越的部分。那当时就是美国的军营，他们只要移地，不管从哪里移到哪里，就立刻在那个地方就会有就是相对应的性交易产业的产生。那整个南越政府当时性交易当然是不合法的，但是整个南越政府还是采取一个就是放任的态度，因为他们基本上就是认为，反正美国士兵他们需要女人，然后我们需要钱，所以你们就去买吧，你们就把你们自己卖给他们，你们就好好赚钱吧。那所以在那个时候，确实在南越有非常多性交易相关的文献留下来。那但在那个同时，北越的情况，北越在社会主义之下的那个情况，就是我们基本上现在还找不太到档案可以来验证的一个问题。但是我刚刚会把就是这个越南在越战期间的性交易拿进来，跟这个改革开放期间的性交易做出一个比较，其实只是想要比较他们性交易在不同的电影当中所呈现出来的样子。我其实并没有要再直接做出一个他们在历史上是有连续的这样子的一个推论。
Thank you for our interpretation. Because of the time limit, I think maybe you can just briefly respond to my questions if you have any, and then we will. I don't know if we have time for more questions, but I think maybe you respond.
Yeah, I'll go very briefly through this. So first of all, the question of the season of hope. Yeah. Actually, yes. Some scholars and reviewers call the season of the prostitute in 3 seasons season of hope. Why? I think maybe because they see that there is some improvement in the character of the prostitutes, the moral improvement. That's what I think. And then there's also a very important question of what is Western centrism. I think in this particular case, Western centrism, in my view, is the popularization of Western views of, in this particular case, Vietnamese people in society. And so, for example, I showed the slides of the films, the three famous American Vietnam War films, and there's and they actually, the Vietnamese characters in these films actually usually they have no stories. That's one thing. They have no depth, and sometimes they don't even have a dialogue at all. And when they have dialogues, it's also interesting that most of these people don't actually speak Vietnamese. Well, they do speak Vietnamese, but because of the actors, they are not Vietnamese. They are maybe Filipina, so they speak Vietnamese, but I can't understand the thing they say. So it's just a matter of a face to these films. It's an Asian face, so it might represent Vietnamese people. So that's what I meant by stereotypes in these films, not just stereotypes, but also representation of Vietnamese people in these films. They do not have a story. They do not have anything to say, and no depth. And that is why, that leads to your question of why Three Seasons actually debunks why I say that Three Seasons debunks Western stereotypes, Hollywood stereotypes of Vietnamese people, while in fact the prostitute is actually a morally bad character. It's not about whether the character is bad or good, but about whether they have a story, whether they have any depth in their character. And also, why is, I said something about the facts that some people call, for example, Three Seasons Vietnamese, right? Why is that? Why does it contribute to Western centrism instead of demonopolizing it, as I think as they intend? That is because when they say Vietnamese, they actually mean Vietnamese people living in America. So they are actually just talking about America, American people. And so the Vietnamese people in Vietnam, they do not matter in this when they say Vietnamese. It's just Vietnamese in wealthy Western country that are represented, and not Vietnamese in like Vietnam, for example, or in Laos or Cambodia. They are never like taken into account there. So that's what I mean when I say this actually contributes to Western centrism. And I mean, I would just ask for clarification. I wouldn't ask for them to stop calling these people Vietnamese because they are Vietnamese. Just that they are not all Vietnamese and they have a different story. And other Vietnamese populations have different stories, different histories, and different interpretations of history. And then, yeah, are there other films that show nostalgia for the old days? Actually, yes, there are some. Actually, there is a very good film about, I think it's called The Glorious Days of Mae Thao, a village. And it shows nostalgia, like very, nostalgic sentimentality about the colonial days in the North, and how modernity ruins everything. The last remark on this is that even though Vietnam the Vietnamese Communist Party is a monopoly, a political monopoly, and it has quite strict censorship on cultural products, especially cinema, films. So, but even if that is the case, some films actually succeed to say something, not just commercial films. Well, Vietnamese cinema is overwhelmingly commercial for sure, but at the same time there are films that actually have something to say, even things that are against the state. And in those cases, they are clever enough to do that within boundary, because they cannot just go out there and say like very antagonistic things about the government. That is not, that Vietnam is not, well, I actually shouldn't say that. They are actually quite clever about saying things in cinema, and they get away with it, But in fact, when you talked about different audiences and how that actually inform the messages of the films. Yeah, some art films have things to say, but actually they are not that popular to the Vietnamese people. So they are popular in like international film festivals, sure, but inside the country, films like Le Hoang's films are more popular, and so that's why in this project, not just these films, but also other films that I work with in my project, I try to use both art house films and even commercial films as well, so that we can see like how these are different. Right. Thank you.
Okay. Already 10 past 9. If there are any questions from the vote, okay. Well, but maybe we collect more and that's at the same time. Oh. Okay. Sorry. Is that your questions? No. Okay. Then do we have more questions? Okay. You go first, and then you, and then we have 3 questions first. Okay.
感谢就今天的演讲是，然后我想请的就是说关于那个 Tony Bui 的这个恋与恋3季，就是说他有讲到说他是那个是在美国的越南人拍摄的电影，然后在香港的各个电影也有很大的那个回响，但是呢就是说，然后应该讲到就是关于这部电影在越南。就是在越南人的那个怎么样看待这部电影？因为我看到越南的那个评论网站，虽然我不懂越南文，可是我发现它收到了很高的评价。就是说，虽然说这个是一个在美国的越南人拍摄的电影，但似乎它也是却引起了那个越南人的那个在越南人心中的这个共鸣。好像说我也有看到那个这个评价就是说，它是比那个 Street Girl 或是那个 Bar Girl 或 Street Cinderella 的这个评论，其实从越南那边的评论来看，它还是比这个他们这两部电影的评论还是要高的。是不是说这个越南的观众呢，其实看起来还是比较更喜欢这个Tony Bui做出的这个就梦幻式的这种？其实是说对往昔的这种反应，他比较喜欢这种，不是那个Le Hoang他所呈现出的这种暴力的或是血腥的这种真实存在的这种地下事件，是这样。
Could you move to the one in the middle?
Hello. So thank you for your presentation. I found it very interesting. And I'm interested in the main topic of your dissertation project, which is prostitution in contemporary Vietnam through the lens of Vietnam cinema. But I can see 2 possible meanings of this question. The first one would be analyzing the concrete and social facts of prostitution with the cinematographic support, or analyzing how does the Vietnamese cinema embrace the prostitution issue to create artistic works, like Vietnamese cinema use of prostitution. And I don't know if you are aware or if you agree about analysis of cinema, like for example Walter Benjamin work, saying that cinematographic representation of reality is a representation of over reality, or maybe to be more concrete, I don't know if you know this famous American director quote of Martin Scorsese, saying cinema is what is in the framework, but also what is outside the frames. I agree with it. It means we have to analyze what the director shows, but also what he decided not to show. And for example, Le Hoang's movie maybe showing a very subversive figure of prostitutes, maybe so subversive that they are over real, but what he don't show is maybe even more interesting. For example, is he showing the sex scenes, which are the very concrete reality of prostitution? If not, we could think that it remains taboo, like in secret. And so to summarize my question, are you analyzing the prostitution fact in cinematographic world as an use of the reality, or are you analyzing the realm of prostitution through cinematographic representation? And if it's the second one, do you agree on the methodology of regarding mostly what movies don't show?
Can you repeat your question, please?
Yeah. About your subject of dissertation, are you analyzing the prostitution fact in cinematographic worlds, like in movies, as an use of the reality, or are you analyzing the realm of prostitution through cinematographic representations, like cinema to understand the reality? And if it's this one, do you agree on the methodology of regarding what the movies don't show? I hope this is clear. It's maybe complicated.
Okay, we have the third question in front. Do you choose prostitution as a research topic, or would you include different sexualities like lesbian, gay, transgenders into your analysis? Okay, we have 3 questions. I think it's enough for today's last one. Okay.
Okay, all right.
Translator.
那所以我只翻那个英文翻，我只把刚刚那个英文的发问翻译成中文。OK， 那他说的是他对于就是和他的博士论文题目非常感兴趣，也就是他关注的，也就是他的博士论文题目就是在越南电影镜头下的当代越南的性交易这个题目。那他的问题基本上想要问的是，就是所以汉所关注的这个越南的性交易，在越南镜头之中，你是要把越南电影当做一个事实来分析，还是你要把越南电影里面的性交易当做一个我们可以通过这个电影来了解现实。也就是说，意思是你关注的是整个电影作为一个政治社会的结果，还是你要把电影里面所描述的这个性交易单独拿出来看，然后作为一个批判的对象？
Then I guess I'll answer the last question first, because that's what you just translated, right? Okay, so I think it's an excellent question, and but in short, you gave me 2 options, and I'm going to choose option 2. My research is about using cinema to understand reality of prostitution in Vietnam, and then that leads to the question: what about what cinema doesn't show about prostitution? Actually, my project, and you are right, that my project has 2 aspects to it: reality of prostitution and then cinematic representation of prostitution. And that is why, to account for the parts that isn't shown in the cinema, I do have a quite large section about reality of prostitution in contemporary Vietnam. And of course, it will be put into perspective together with the other periods in history as well. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the excellent question.
OK， 所以我的回答是，我是把电影当做一个我来了解现实的其中一个方法。那所以在我的博士论文里面，其实有2大主要的部分，一个部分当然就是电影这个部分，那另外一个部分就是在现实当中的性交易的部分。那所以这也就是回答到你刚说的问题，就是在电影当中没有被展现出来的那些东西，我的博士论文当中有一个在现实当中的情况的一个研究。
The first question.
So the first question in English is that the audience he has checked the review online to see how the Vietnamese receive the Tony Bui's film and the film of the Hoang, and he finds that even the domestic Vietnam people, it seems like they love Tony Bui's film more than the Hoang, and so he's asking if in reality the Vietnamese they love the nostalgia more than the violence in the Hoang's film.
Alright, thank you. I think almost everyone would agree that Three Seasons is better cinema for sure. And Le Hoang's films are not very good cinema. And I think that might account for part of why the reviewers that you read liked Three Seasons better than the other two films. But I cannot say that because of that, I can say that Vietnamese people like the nostalgia in Three Seasons more than, or nostalgia for the past in general more than contemporary life with violence, you know. I cannot answer to that, but in terms of cinema, I think I agree that Three Seasons is a better film, better cinema. Yeah. And for nostalgia, I don't know, I'm not sure whether people prefer nostalgia or contemporary life with violence. But thank you.
Another question was that the Three Seasons is yes, the Three Seasons is filmed by the American Vietnamese director who did not actually live in Vietnam since he was 2 years old. So how could he did relate to the local Vietnamese? Since, although he did not live with them, how could his movie can do this?
所以问题我想要再追问你一个问题，就是说因为裴东尼他2岁就离开越南了，那他没有跟越南人生活在一起，那他到底怎么样拍出越南人的这个故事？
Right. So, I mean, in terms of relatability, well, of course, Tony Bui had to do research for making his film. He had to go back to Vietnam, visit, talk to the people, and look at what happens there. And then he shaped his own. That experience. Those experiences shaped his own perception and construction of the reality, and that's what he brought into his film. So there is a level of relatability for sure. But I'm also not saying that Le Hoang, because he lives in Vietnam, everybody relates to his experience. It's just something that I think that these two directors brought into their films because of their experiences. But I cannot say whether the audiences relate to which one more, you know.
Okay, because of the time limit, we still have 2 more questions here.
Alright.
So maybe I will read the second one and then you answer at the same time. Okay. Together. Read that Tony Bui is an outsider filming in Vietnam. Didn't he also get restricted to what he could showcase as well? I think this question is very similar to the student series. So maybe you can go for the first question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think, well, just a little bit to add to this question. Was he restricted in terms of what he could show in his film because he was working with the government? Then, yeah, I mean, I guess so. He negotiated with the government in Vietnam, but also with the producers in the US, because the film was produced by Harvey Keitel, one of the actors, very famous actors, the American actors, who also is the character in the film. So they did some negotiations in terms of the governments in Vietnam. I mean, there is no criticism, like outward criticism about the Vietnamese government anyway, so that shouldn't be, it wasn't a problem there. And just to emphasize that just because it's a communist government doesn't mean that you can't say anything about the government. You can say things. It's just there's a limit. You can't say that we should have a coup d'etat and we should overthrow the government. That speech is not allowed, and you might be imprisoned for provoking people. But otherwise, like, not to that extreme, but other things you can still say. And then the first one, why do you choose prostitution as your research topic? Would you include different sexualities like lesbian, gay, transgender into your analysis? Actually, I started with more than just prostitution, and there were some, but you know, because it's a dissertation project, so I cannot cover everything, so I narrowed it down to prostitution. And even though in these 3 films there are only female prostitutes, but actually in other films there are also male prostitutes and like are they transgendered? Not so much transgendered, but like cross-dressing prostitute characters. So yes, there is that.
OK， 那还是回答一下，就是那这个裴东尼他这么早就离开了越南，他到底怎么样拍出一个跟越南这么拍出一个能够说服所有越南人的故事？那当然就是裴东尼他的拍摄这个电影的时候，也跟越南政府，除了他是在美国制片公司，那在跟越南政府之间也有非常多的往返跟协调。那然后另外一个问题是，就是为什么我会选择就是性交易来作为我的博士论文题目？那其实我本来其实也有非常多就是各方面的兴趣，但是因为这是一个博士论文研究计划，所以我必须要缩减我的题目的范围。那所以最后我就主要以性交易来作为题目。那当然就是我也并不只，那当然只是因为今天的3部电影刚好都是女性的场景，所以没有看到其他的性别或其他的跨性别。那在其他的电影分析当中，也有一些是就是男妓的问题，还有一些跨性别的相关的问题的讨论。
OK， 好，因为时间的限制已经几乎9点半了，所以非常谢谢今天所有的讲者。那麻烦大家跟我一起再次感谢今天的讲者。